From ARSINOE II, marrying her own brother to lock down the Nile throne, to Maria Antonia fading away as two empires fought over her baby, this is a calm yet eerie journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with why an Egyptian queen chose her sibling as a husband, and move deeper into how a tangled Habsburg family tree produced a child king who could barely survive. So, put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. ARSINOE II, sister queen of the Nile. In the shimmering heat of ancient Alexandria, where the Mediterranean meets the Nile Delta, a princess was born who would reshape the very notion of royal marriage. ARSINOE II entered the world around 316 BCE into the glittering court of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's most ambitious generals. The Ptolemies had claimed Egypt as their prize after Alexander's empire shattered, and they ruled it not as native pharaohs, but as Macedonian Greeks, who saw themselves as living gods. Young ARSINOE grew up surrounded by the intoxicating blend of Greek learning and Egyptian mysticism that made Alexandria the intellectual jewel of the ancient world. The great library rose before her eyes, its scrolls containing the wisdom of centuries. Ships from across the known world docked at Alexandria's harbors, bringing spices, silk, and stories from distant lands. Yet for all this cosmopolitan splendor, the Ptolemaic court remained insularly Greek, speaking the language of Homer while ruling over millions of Egyptians whose customs they barely understood. From her earliest years, ARSINOE would have understood that her body was not her own, but a diplomatic tool in the great game of Hellenistic politics. The wars that followed Alexander's death had carved his empire into competing kingdoms, each ruled by one of his former generals or their descendants. Marriage alliances were the threads that held this fractious world together, and royal daughters were the shuttles that wove those threads. Her first marriage came in 300 BCE, when she was barely 16, to Lysimachus of Thrace. He was one of Alexander's aging bodyguards turned king, now in his 50s and ruling the wild lands north of the Aegean. For ARSINOE, raised in the refined luxury of Alexandria, Thrace must have seemed like exile to the edge of the world. The marriage was purely political, cementing an alliance between her father and this grizzled veteran who controlled the vital passages between Europe and Asia. Lysimachus had already buried 2 wives and fathered several children, but ARSINOE proved herself more than a decorative bride. She bore him 3 sons and quickly established herself as a force at his court. Contemporary accounts describe her as intelligent and ambitious. With the sharp political instincts that ran in Ptolemaic blood, she navigated the treacherous waters of Thracian court politics, where Greek refinement mixed uneasily with the tribal traditions of the region's original inhabitants. But the world of the successors was brutally unstable. Lysimachus, despite his military prowess, found himself increasingly isolated as younger, more vigorous rulers pressed their claims. In 281 BCE, at the Battle of Corupedium, his luck finally ran out. Seleucus, another of Alexander's veterans, defeated and killed the old king. ARSINOE, now widowed at 35 with 3 young sons, faced a desperate situation. What followed was a masterclass in royal survival. Rather than flee immediately, ARSINOE attempted to hold Lysimachus's capital, Ephesus, hoping to secure her children's inheritance. She even entered into negotiations with Seleucus, the victor, but these collapsed when he was assassinated by Ptolemy Keraunos, her own half-brother. The irony was bitter. Family ties, which should have offered protection, instead brought fresh danger. Keraunos had his own designs on Thrace and saw ARSINOE's children as rivals. In a move that would have scandalized later European courts, he proposed marriage to his half-sister, claiming it would unite their claims. ARSINOE, perhaps calculating that this offered her best chance of protecting her sons, agreed. The marriage was brief and brutal. Keraunos murdered 2 of her children almost immediately, and drove ARSINOE into exile. She fled across the Aegean with her surviving son, seeking refuge in the one place that should have been safe, home. But Egypt, in 279 BCE, was not the stable kingdom she had left 20 years earlier. Her brother Ptolemy II had inherited their father's throne, but his position was far from secure. Egypt faced threats from the Seleucids in the east, Antigonids in the north, and increasingly assertive native Egyptian priests in the south. It was in this moment of mutual vulnerability that brother and sister conceived their revolutionary solution. Sometime around 278 BCE, Ptolemy II divorced his first wife, ARSINOE I, and married his full sister, ARSINOE II. The decision sent shockwaves through the Greek world. While Egyptian pharaohs had occasionally married their siblings, the Ptolemies had always maintained their Greek identity, and Greeks traditionally viewed sibling marriage with horror. The political logic, however, was compelling. Marriage to ARSINOE gave Ptolemy II an experienced queen who had already proven her diplomatic skills in Thrace. More importantly, it concentrated Ptolemaic blood and legitimacy in a way that foreign marriages could not. Their children would be purely Ptolemaic, with no competing claims from maternal relatives. In a world where royal legitimacy often depended on divine approval, the siblings took an even bolder step. They declared themselves gods. The deification of Ptolemy II and ARSINOE II as the Philadelphoi, the sibling, loving gods, transformed their scandalous marriage into a sacred act. They drew parallels to Zeus and Hera, who were also siblings and spouses in Greek mythology. Egyptian religion, with its tradition of divine pharaohs, provided additional precedent. What had been aberrant became holy. What was politically expedient became religiously mandated. ARSINOE II proved herself worthy of deification through her political acumen. She became Ptolemy II's closest advisor, and together they expanded Egyptian power across the eastern Mediterranean. Their fleets dominated the Aegean. Their armies pushed into Palestine and southern Asia Minor. The wealth of Egypt, carefully managed through royal monopolies on everything from papyrus to perfume, funded this expansion. The queen's image appeared on coins throughout the Ptolemaic realm, sometimes alone, sometimes paired with her brother husband. These coins were not mere currency but propaganda, spreading the message of the divine siblings' legitimacy to every corner of their empire. Temples across Egypt honored her as a goddess, and her cult would continue long after her death. Yet, for all their success, questions lingered. What were the costs of this revolutionary marriage? Unlike later royal dynasties that would practice systematic inbreeding, Ptolemy II and ARSINOE II appear to have had no surviving children together. Whether this was by choice, chance, or the early manifestation of genetic incompatibility, we cannot know. The limited evidence from their reign suggests both siblings enjoyed relatively good health, but the genetic consequences of their decision would become apparent only in later generations. ARSINOE II died in 270 BCE, after less than a decade as Queen of Egypt. She was perhaps 46 years old, having lived through 3 marriages, civil wars, exile, and the transformation of herself into a goddess. Her brother husband mourned her publicly and continued her deification, ensuring that her image and cult would outlive them both. She had taken a desperate gamble, marrying her brother to secure political survival, and turned it into a new model of royal legitimacy that would define the Ptolemaic dynasty for the next 3 centuries. The precedent she and Ptolemy II established would echo through history, inspiring and justifying countless other royal marriages between close relatives. They had proven that what society condemned could be transformed through power, propaganda, and religious innovation. It was a lesson that future generations of inbred royalty would remember well. Cleopatra v. Last flower of the Ptolemies. Nearly 3 centuries after ARSINOE II first shocked the Greek world by marrying her brother, another Ptolemaic princess faced the mirror of history, seeing in her reflection the accumulated weight of generations upon generations of intermarriage. Cleopatra VII, the woman whose name would become synonymous with ancient glamour and political cunning, was the final product of the most systematically inbred royal bloodline in recorded history. Born in 69 BCE, Cleopatra entered a world where the Ptolemaic practice of sibling marriage had become not just accepted, but essential to royal identity. Where ARSINOE II had scandalized her contemporaries, Cleopatra's marriages to her younger brothers barely raised an eyebrow among observers who had grown accustomed to 300 years of Ptolemaic incest. The family tree that connected her to the dynasty's founder resembled not so much a tree as a ladder, with each generation connected to the next by the narrowest possible genetic bridge. To understand the full implications of Cleopatra's ancestry, one must trace the tangled web of marriages that produced her. After Ptolemy II and ARSINOE II established the precedent, nearly every subsequent Ptolemaic ruler married a close relative, usually a full sibling. Ptolemy III married his half-sister. Ptolemy IV married his full sister, ARSINOE III. Ptolemy V married his niece. The pattern continued with remorseless consistency, each generation further concentrating the genetic material of the dynasty's founders. By Cleopatra's time, genetic diversity within the Ptolemaic line had been so thoroughly eliminated that she likely had fewer unique ancestors than a typical person of her era might count as great-great-grandparents. Modern geneticists estimate that her inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how closely related her parents were, approached levels typically seen only in laboratory mouse colonies bred for genetic uniformity. Yet this genetic homogeneity came wrapped in the mythology of divine kingship that the Ptolemies had cultivated for centuries. They were not merely royalty, they were living gods, and their blood was literally sacred. To dilute that blood with foreign marriages would be not just politically disadvantageous, but religiously sacrilegious. The very inbreeding that modern science recognizes as dangerous was, in Ptolemaic ideology, a source of their supernatural authority. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had violated this tradition by taking a foreign wife, possibly a member of the Egyptian priesthood rather than a Greek noblewoman. This deviation from dynastic practice had contributed to his political troubles and eventual exile. The lesson was clear. The Ptolemies maintained power through purity of blood, not through the foreign alliances that sustained other royal houses. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, he left the throne jointly to 18-year-old Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII, following the by now ancient custom of sibling co-rule and marriage. The age gap between them was larger than usual, but it hardly mattered. Ptolemaic marriages had long been primarily symbolic anyway, with real power typically concentrated in the hands of the more capable sibling. Cleopatra, despite her youth, quickly proved herself the more capable ruler. She had received the full Ptolemaic education, speaking at least 9 languages, including, uniquely among her dynasty, Egyptian itself. She understood both the Greek learning preserved in Alexandria's libraries and the ancient traditions of pharaonic rule. Most importantly, she grasped the new reality of Mediterranean politics, where the rising power of Rome increasingly determined the fate of all other kingdoms. The marriage to Ptolemy XIII was by all accounts a purely ceremonial arrangement. The young king remained under the influence of his advisors, particularly the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, who viewed Cleopatra's growing independence with alarm. As tensions escalated, civil war became inevitable. By 48 BCE, Cleopatra had been driven from Alexandria and was gathering support in southern Egypt, while her brother-husband controlled the capital. It was at this moment of dynastic crisis that Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey. The meeting between Cleopatra and Caesar would become one of history's most famous encounters, dramatized in countless works of art and literature. But beneath the romantic legend lay cold political calculation. Cleopatra needed Roman support to defeat her brother. Caesar needed Egyptian wealth and grain to fund his own ambitions. The alliance proved successful beyond either party's initial expectations. Caesar's veteran legions quickly defeated Ptolemy XIII's forces, and the young king died, possibly murdered, in 47 BCE. Cleopatra was restored as sole ruler, though now as a Roman client rather than an independent monarch. To maintain the fiction of Ptolemaic tradition, she quickly married her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was perhaps 11 years old at the time of their wedding. This second sibling marriage was even more obviously a formality than the first. Ptolemy XIV never wielded real power and died in 44 BCE, possibly poisoned on Cleopatra's orders. By then, she had already borne Caesar's son, Caesarion, and was preparing for the next phase of her political strategy. The boy king's death freed her from the constraints of traditional Ptolemaic joint rule and allowed her to position herself as the sole legitimate heir to centuries of pharaonic authority. Cleopatra's relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony have often been portrayed as purely romantic affairs, but they represented something far more significant: the final abandonment of the Ptolemaic strategy of genetic isolation. After 300 years of systematic inbreeding, she chose to forge her dynasty's future through alliances with Rome's most powerful men. Her children with Caesar and Antony would carry Ptolemaic blood, but they would also inherit the political possibilities that came with Roman parentage. The decision reflected both pragmatic politics and possible biological necessity. The Ptolemaic gene pool had become so constricted that the dynasty's long-term survival may have depended on the introduction of new genetic material. While ancient sources provide little direct evidence of health problems among the later Ptolemies, the mathematical inevitability of genetic damage from such intensive inbreeding suggests that the royal family was living on borrowed time. Modern geneticists have attempted to reconstruct the likely health consequences of Ptolemaic intermarriage, with inbreeding coefficients approaching 0.5, meaning that Cleopatra's parents were more closely related than typical full siblings. The dynasty should have suffered from numerous recessive genetic disorders. These might have included increased rates of infant mortality, mental disabilities, physical deformities, and reduced fertility, all of which could explain the dynasty's gradual decline in political effectiveness. Yet, Cleopatra herself appears to have been remarkably healthy and capable, suggesting either exceptional genetic luck or the possibility that harmful recessive alleles had already been purged from the Ptolemaic line through natural selection. Her intelligence was legendary even among her enemies, her political skills sophisticated enough to outmaneuver some of Rome's ablest statesmen, and her fertility apparently normal, as evidenced by her 4 children. The contrast between Cleopatra's evident capabilities and the genetic catastrophe that her ancestry should have produced remains one of history's puzzles. Perhaps the most plausible explanation is that the Ptolemies had been fortunate enough to carry relatively few seriously harmful recessive mutations, or that centuries of inbreeding had already eliminated the most dangerous ones through the deaths of affected offspring. Whatever the biological realities, Cleopatra's cultural and intellectual achievements were undeniable. She transformed Alexandria into a center of learning and artistic patronage that rivaled Rome itself. Her court attracted scholars, poets, and philosophers from across the Mediterranean world. She patronized the construction of temples throughout Egypt and maintained the complex religious traditions that legitimized pharaonic rule in the eyes of her Egyptian subjects. But even as she cultivated her image as the reincarnation of Isis and the last pharaoh of Egypt, Cleopatra understood that the future belonged to Rome. Her children with Antony were given Roman names and groomed for roles in the expanding Roman world. She seems to have envisioned a future in which Ptolemaic legitimacy would be preserved through integration with Roman power rather than through continued genetic isolation. The dream ended with Antony's defeat at Actium in 31 BCE. Cleopatra's suicide the following year marked not just the end of her personal ambitions, but the conclusion of a unique experiment in royal breeding that had lasted for 3 centuries. No other dynasty in recorded history had practiced sibling marriage so consistently or for so long. The genetic consequences of that experiment died with her, leaving only legends, monuments, and the haunting question of what costs the Ptolemies paid for their divine purity. In death, Cleopatra became a symbol of many things: female power, exotic glamour, the clash between East and West. But perhaps her most significant legacy was the demonstration that even the most systematic inbreeding could produce, against all biological odds, individuals of extraordinary capability and charisma. She was the last flower of a bloodline that should have withered generations earlier, blooming with improbable brilliance just before the final extinction. MERITATEN, Princess of Amarna. In the sun-baked ruins of Amarna, where the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten once built his revolutionary capital dedicated to a single god, archaeologists have uncovered fragments of a lost world that challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient Egyptian royal marriage. Among the broken statues and scattered hieroglyphs, one name appears with haunting frequency: MERITATEN, eldest daughter of Akhenaten, whose brief life illuminates the dangerous intersection of religious revolution, political upheaval, and the concentrated genetics of Egypt's most radical dynasty. Born around 1348 BCE, MERITATEN entered a world in the midst of unprecedented transformation. Her father, originally named Amenhotep IV, had abandoned the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods in favor of worshipping only the Aten, the solar disk. This wasn't merely a religious reform, but a complete reimagining of Egyptian civilization. The old capital at Thebes, with its powerful priesthood of Amun, was abandoned for a new city built from nothing in the desert of Middle Egypt. The woman who bore MERITATEN was almost certainly Nefertiti, whose name means, "The beautiful one has come." But recent archaeological evidence suggests that Nefertiti may herself have been Akhenaten's sister, making their marriage another example of the close-kin unions that had become increasingly common in the 18th dynasty. If true, this would mean that MERITATEN was the product of a sibling marriage, carrying an inbreeding coefficient higher than any previous Egyptian princess. The Amarna court operated according to its own unique rules, many of which seemed designed to concentrate power and purity within the immediate royal family. Unlike traditional Egyptian practice, which often saw pharaohs taking multiple wives to cement political alliances, Akhenaten appears to have been devoted exclusively to Nefertiti. Their marriage was presented not just as a political partnership, but as a sacred union blessed by the Aten himself. Artistic representations from Amarna show the royal family in unprecedented intimacy. Where previous Egyptian art had depicted pharaohs as remote, godlike figures, Akhenaten and Nefertiti appear with their daughters in domestic scenes of startling tenderness. MERITATEN is shown as a young girl playing with her sisters beneath the rays of the Aten, the sun disk whose light blessed their family's revolutionary experiment. But as MERITATEN grew to adolescence, the experimental nature of Amarna society began to take on darker implications. The city that had been built as a paradise for the worship of the one true God was beginning to show signs of internal strain. The abandonment of traditional religious practices had alienated much of the Egyptian priesthood and nobility. Economic problems, possibly related to climate change and failed Nile floods, were creating hardship throughout the kingdom. Most disturbing of all, the royal family itself was beginning to show signs of the genetic stress that might be expected from intensive inbreeding. Recent DNA analysis of mummies from the period has revealed evidence of various congenital disorders within the immediate royal family. Akhenaten himself may have suffered from Marfan syndrome or a related connective tissue disorder, which would explain the elongated features depicted in Amarna art. The evidence becomes even more troubling when we examine what happened to MERITATEN's siblings. Of the 6 daughters born to Akhenaten and Nefertiti, several appear to have died young, and others vanish from the historical record without explanation. The high rate of infant and child mortality within the royal family suggests that the concentration of genetic material had reached dangerous levels. It was in this context that MERITATEN, as the eldest surviving daughter, found herself thrust into a role for which no precedent existed in Egyptian history. As the AMARNA experiment began to collapse, she appears to have been married to her own father, becoming his co-ruler and presumably his wife in both name and fact. The evidence for this shocking arrangement comes from inscriptions and artistic depictions that show her in the traditional role of royal consort, wearing the crowns and regalia previously associated with Nefertiti. The marriage between MERITATEN and Akhenaten represents perhaps the most extreme example of royal inbreeding in recorded history. Father-daughter marriages were unknown in previous Egyptian practice and were considered abhorrent by most ancient civilizations. Yet the desperate circumstances of the AMARNA period, combined with the ideological isolation of Akhenaten's court, appear to have made the unthinkable seem necessary. The political logic behind this union was presumably similar to that which had motivated earlier royal marriages, the concentration of legitimacy and power within the bloodline of the pharaoh. With Nefertiti apparently dead or fallen from favor, and with the broader Egyptian elite increasingly hostile to the AMARNA experiment, Akhenaten may have seen marriage to his daughter as the only way to ensure the continuity of his religious revolution. But if the marriage was intended to strengthen the royal family, it appears to have had the opposite effect. The genetic consequences of such intensive inbreeding would have been catastrophic. Any children born to MERITATEN and Akhenaten would have had an inbreeding coefficient approaching the theoretical maximum, making them vulnerable to every recessive genetic disorder carried by their common ancestors. The historical record becomes frustratingly unclear at this point. We know that MERITATEN disappeared from official inscriptions sometime during the latter years of Akhenaten's reign, but we don't know how or why. She may have died in childbirth, succumbed to one of the genetic disorders that plagued the royal family, or simply been written out of history by those who later sought to erase all memory of the AMARNA period. What we do know is that the AMARNA experiment died with Akhenaten around 1336 BCE. His immediate successor was a mysterious figure known as Smenkhkare, who may have been another of his children, or possibly MERITATEN herself ruling under a masculine name. The reign was brief, lasting perhaps only a year or two before power passed to the boy king Tutankhamun, who abandoned AMARNA and restored the traditional gods. Recent DNA studies of Tutankhamun's mummy have revealed that he too suffered from numerous genetic disorders, including a cleft palate, spina bifida, and other developmental abnormalities that were likely the result of inbreeding. These findings provide crucial insight into the probable health of his close relatives, including MERITATEN. If the boy king, who lived to be 19, suffered from such severe genetic problems, it seems likely that his sister, or half-sister, endured similar afflictions. The tragedy of MERITATEN lies not just in her probable suffering but in what her life represents about the dangers of ideological extremism combined with genetic isolation. The AMARNA court's attempt to create a pure, divinely blessed royal family led them into territory that even previous practitioners of royal inbreeding had avoided. The result was not divine perfection but biological catastrophe. Yet there remains something poignant about the artistic depictions of MERITATEN from the early AMARNA period. In those reliefs, she appears as a young princess playing in the sunlight with her sisters, protected by parents who genuinely seem to have loved their children. The domestic intimacy of these scenes suggests that, whatever their theological and political delusions, Akhenaten and Nefertiti created a family environment marked by unusual warmth and affection. The contrast between this early happiness and MERITATEN's probable fate illuminates one of the cruelest ironies of royal inbreeding. The very practices intended to preserve and protect royal bloodlines often destroyed them instead. In trying to keep their divine essence pure, The pharaohs of Egypt created genetic time bombs that would eventually explode in the form of sterility, deformity, mental illness, and early death. MERITATEN's story ends in silence, her voice lost in the ruins of AMARNA, her fate unknown and perhaps unknowable. But the fragments that remain tell a story that would be repeated, with variations, in royal courts across the world for millennia to come. They remind us that behind the golden masks and divine titles of ancient monarchy lay real human beings, often children, whose lives were shaped by forces they could neither understand nor control. Mama OCLLO, sacred queen of Cusco, high in the rarefied air of the Andes, where the ancient city of Cusco nestles in its valley like a jewel in a crown of mountains. The chroniclers tell us that the gods themselves walked the earth and founded an empire. The story begins with two divine siblings, Manco Capac and Mama OCLLO, sent by their father Inti, the sun god, to bring civilization to the scattered tribes of the highlands. According to legend, they emerged from the sacred waters of Lake Titicaca, carrying with them a golden staff that would mark the spot where they should establish their capital. Like many origin myths, this tale of the first Inca rulers contains kernels of historical truth wrapped in layers of religious symbolism and political propaganda. What emerges from careful analysis of Inca chronicles, Spanish colonial records, and archaeological evidence is a picture of a royal culture that, like the Ptolemies of Egypt, used sibling marriage as a cornerstone of political and religious legitimacy. Mama OCLLO, whose name means mother egg or mother coca, represents the archetypal Coya, the title given to the principal wife of the Sapa Inca, the emperor who ruled the vast Andean realm known as Tawantinsuyu. In Inca ideology, the Coya was not merely the emperor's spouse, but his divine counterpart, the earthly representative of Mama Quilla, the moon goddess, just as the Sapa Inca embodied Inti, the sun. The marriage between these cosmic forces was understood to be both necessary and sacred. Just as the sun and moon governed the cycles of day and night, planting and harvest, so the union of Sapa Inca and Coya maintained the cosmic balance upon which the empire's prosperity depended. This wasn't merely poetic metaphor but practical theology, encoded in the administrative and ceremonial structures that governed millions of people across thousands of miles of mountain terrain. For the marriage to achieve its full sacred power, however, both partners needed to be of the purest possible divine essence. This meant that the Coya should ideally be the Sapa Inca's full sister, sharing exactly the same divine parentage, and thus the same claim to solar descent. Other wives, taken for political reasons from conquered peoples or allied nobles, might bear the emperor's children and hold honored positions at court, but they could never achieve the cosmic significance of the sister wife. The practical implementation of this system meant that Inca royal families faced the same genetic pressures that had affected the Ptolemies, though perhaps with somewhat less intensity. Where the Ptolemies had practiced sibling marriage for over 2 centuries with remarkable consistency, the Inca system allowed for more variation. Not every Sapa Inca married his full sister. Some married half-sisters, cousins, or even unrelated noblewomen when circumstances required it. The daily life of a Coya like Mama OCLLO would have been structured around elaborate ceremonial duties that reflected her cosmic significance. She presided over the worship of Mama Quilla and the constellation of female deities that governed fertility, agriculture, and domestic life. During the great festivals that marked the agricultural calendar, she would appear alongside her brother-husband in rituals designed to ensure the fertility of the land and the continued favor of the gods. Archaeological evidence from Cusco and other Inca sites reveals the material splendor that surrounded these divine rulers. The Coya wore clothing woven from the finest vicuña wool, dyed with precious pigments, and decorated with gold and silver threads. Her jewelry incorporated emeralds, turquoise, and other precious stones, while her ceremonial vessels were crafted from gold that the Incas considered the sweat of the sun itself. But beneath this glittering surface lay the same biological realities that had haunted other inbreeding royal dynasties. Spanish chroniclers, writing in the decades after the conquest, recorded details about the Inca royal family that suggest genetic problems were becoming apparent by the time of the empire's fall. Several of the later Sapa Incas were described as having physical abnormalities or mental instabilities that may have resulted from generations of close-kin marriage. The chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon, writing in the 1540s, described meeting elderly nobles who remembered the reigns of several Sapa Incas. Their accounts suggest that while some rulers were capable and vigorous, others suffered from ailments that modern geneticists would recognize as consistent with inbreeding depression. These included increased rates of infant mortality among royal children, physical deformities, and what the Spanish described as melancholy or madness, terms that might encompass various mental health conditions. The genetic evidence becomes more concrete when we examine the mummified remains of Inca royalty that have been discovered in recent decades. High-altitude burials in the Andes have preserved these remains with remarkable fidelity, allowing modern scientists to conduct DNA analysis that would have been impossible with remains from most other ancient civilizations. Studies of these royal mummies have revealed elevated rates of genetic markers associated with inbreeding, including increased homozygosity, the presence of identical alleles for specific genes that occurs when closely related individuals reproduce. While the sample size is small and the analysis is ongoing, the preliminary results suggest that Inca royal families did indeed suffer from the genetic consequences of their marriage practices. More dramatic evidence comes from the preserved remains of child sacrifices discovered at high-altitude shrine sites throughout the former Inca Empire. These children, known as capacocha, were often selected from noble families and sometimes from the royal family itself. Analysis of their remains has revealed unusually high rates of congenital abnormalities, possibly suggesting that children with obvious genetic defects were considered especially sacred and therefore suitable for sacrifice to the gods. The Spanish conquest of 1532 brought an abrupt end to the Inca practice of royal sibling marriage, but not without leaving detailed records of how the system had operated. Colonial administrators, intent on understanding and controlling their new subjects, compiled extensive genealogies of Inca royal families. These documents, while sometimes contradictory and always filtered through Spanish cultural assumptions, provide our best evidence for how the system of royal inbreeding actually functioned. What emerges from these colonial records is a picture of a royal marriage system that was both more flexible and more genetically dangerous than Spanish observers initially understood. While the ideal remained the marriage of full siblings, political realities often required compromises. When suitable sisters were unavailable, half-sisters might be chosen. When even these were lacking, the emperor might marry a close cousin or, in extreme cases, a more distantly related noblewoman. The flexibility of the system may actually have made its genetic consequences more severe in some cases. Where the Ptolemies had practiced systematic sibling marriage, creating a relatively stable, if highly inbred, gene pool, the Inca practice of occasional outbreeding, followed by returns to close-kin marriage, created what geneticists call inbreeding loops. These can be even more damaging than consistent inbreeding, as they allow harmful recessive alleles to accumulate while periodically introducing new genetic variants that increase the chance of dangerous combinations. The tragic irony of Mama OCLLO and her successors lies in the gap between the cosmic perfection they were supposed to embody and the biological reality they actually experienced. The very practices that were intended to preserve their divine essence and ensure the empire's prosperity may have weakened the royal family's ability to provide effective leadership during the crucial period when Spanish conquistadors arrived on their shores. Modern genetic research on Andean populations has revealed that indigenous peoples of the region carry relatively high frequencies of certain recessive alleles, possibly as a result of founder effects and geographic isolation. This background genetic structure would have made the Inca royal family particularly vulnerable to the effects of inbreeding, as harmful recessive traits were more likely to be present in both parents of a sibling marriage. The story of Mama OCLLO, whether we understand her as a mythical founder figure or as the prototype for generations of real Koyas, illustrates how the attempt to create genetic and spiritual purity can become a form of biological self-destruction. The empire she helped establish lasted for less than a century as a major power, falling not just to Spanish steel and horses, but perhaps to the accumulated genetic burden of its own royal marriage practices. Princess NAHIENAENA of Hawaii. On the volcanic islands of Hawaii, where ancient Polynesian traditions collided with the revolutionary force of Christian missionary activity, a young princess found herself caught between two irreconcilable worlds. NAHIENAENA, born in 1815 to King Kamehameha I, the great unifier of the Hawaiian Islands, would live her brief 21 years as a symbol of cultural transformation and the tragic personal costs of that transformation. The world into which NAHIENAENA was born operated according to the ancient Polynesian concept of kapu, a complex system of sacred prohibitions and ritual obligations that governed every aspect of Hawaiian life. Among the most fundamental of these kapu was the requirement that members of the highest chiefly class, the ali'i, maintain the purity of their bloodlines through marriage within their own rank. The most sacred marriages were those between full siblings, which concentrated mana, the divine power that legitimized chiefly rule. This practice was not unique to Hawaii, but was found throughout Polynesia, from the Society Islands to New Zealand. The logic was both spiritual and political. Sacred bloodlines carried divine power that could be diluted through marriage with commoners or even lesser nobles. Only by marrying within the immediate family could the ali'i preserve the concentrated mana that made them effective intermediaries between the gods and the people. NAHIENAENA's father, Kamehameha I, had himself married his half-sister Keopolani, following the traditional pattern of ali'i marriages. Their union had been blessed both by Hawaiian tradition and by political success, as Kamehameha used his unified claim to divine legitimacy to conquer and unite the previously warring Hawaiian Islands. The marriage produced several children, including NAHIENAENA and her older brother Kamehameha II, known as Liholiho. But even as NAHIENAENA grew to childhood, the foundations of traditional Hawaiian culture were beginning to shift. The first Christian missionaries had arrived in 1820, when she was only 5 years old, bringing with them not just a new religion but an entirely different understanding of marriage, sexuality, and family relationships. What the Hawaiians considered sacred, the missionaries viewed as abhorrent. What the ali'i saw as necessary for maintaining divine favor, the Christians condemned as sinful. The tension between these worldviews became personal for NAHIENAENA as she reached adolescence. By traditional Hawaiian standards, she should have married her brother Kamehameha III, known as Kauikeaouli, who had inherited the throne after their brother Liholiho's death in 1824. The marriage would have united their claims to divine authority and produced heirs with the maximum possible concentration of sacred mana. But the missionaries who had gained increasing influence over the Hawaiian court viewed such a union as not merely improper, but actively evil. They had already succeeded in converting several members of the royal family to Christianity, including NAHIENAENA herself, who had been baptized and given a Christian education. The princess found herself torn between the traditional expectations of her role as ali'i and the new moral framework she had been taught to embrace. The psychological strain of this conflict was immense. Contemporary accounts describe NAHIENAENA as intelligent and deeply thoughtful, but also increasingly melancholic, as she struggled to reconcile her dual heritage. She understood the political importance of traditional marriage practices. Without them, the legitimacy of Hawaiian rule itself might be questioned. Yet, she had also internalized the Christian teaching that such marriages were sinful and would damn her soul to eternal punishment. The missionaries, led by figures like Hiram Bingham, saw NAHIENAENA's internal conflict as an opportunity to demonstrate the triumph of Christian morality over heathen custom. They counseled her to resist traditional expectations and instead to seek a Christian marriage with an appropriate husband who was not her brother. Some suggested matches with lesser Hawaiian nobles, or even with white settlers who had converted to Christianity and demonstrated their commitment to civilized behavior. But NAHIENAENA's brother and co-ruler, Kamehameha III, faced his own pressures. As king, he needed to maintain the support of traditional Hawaiian nobles who still believed in the old ways. Many of these chiefs viewed the missionaries with suspicion and saw their interference in royal marriage customs as an attack on Hawaiian sovereignty itself. The pressure on Kauikeaouli to marry his sister came not just from tradition but from urgent political necessity. The siblings' relationship during this period appears to have been genuinely affectionate, complicated by, but not limited to the political and religious forces swirling around them. They had grown up together in the royal household, shared the burden of ruling a rapidly changing kingdom, and found in each other perhaps the only people who could truly understand the unique pressures they faced. Whether their attachment was primarily familial, romantic, or some combination of both remains a matter of historical speculation. By the early 1830s, the tension had become unbearable. NAHIENAENA was now in her late teens, well past the age when Hawaiian princesses traditionally married. Every month that passed without a resolution weakened both her position and that of her brother. Traditional chiefs whispered that the royal family had lost its connection to the gods, while missionaries pressed for a definitive rejection of heathen practices. The crisis came to a head around 1834, when NAHIENAENA and Kamehameha III appear to have begun a physical relationship despite the missionaries' opposition. Contemporary letters and diary entries from both Hawaiian and foreign observers suggest that the siblings were secretly meeting and may have been conducting themselves as husband and wife, according to traditional customs, even though no formal marriage ceremony had taken place. The revelation of their relationship caused a scandal that reverberated far beyond the Hawaiian Islands. Missionary letters back to New England described it as evidence of the depths of heathen depravity that still infected Hawaiian society. Traditional Hawaiian nobles, meanwhile, were puzzled by the foreigners' reaction to what they saw as natural and proper behavior for members of the royal family. The psychological toll on NAHIENAENA became increasingly evident. Visitors to the royal court described her as withdrawn and often ill, suffering from what modern observers might recognize as symptoms of severe depression and anxiety. She was caught between loyalty to her brother, obedience to her Christian teachers, and the expectations of her Hawaiian subjects, with no possibility of satisfying all three. In 1836, under intense missionary pressure, NAHIENAENA agreed to marry Leleohoku, a high-ranking chief who was not closely related to her. The marriage was presented as a triumph of Christian morality over heathen custom, and the missionaries celebrated it as evidence that even the highest-ranking Hawaiians could be brought to embrace civilized behavior. But those close to the princess knew that the marriage was a sacrifice made under duress rather than a joyful union. The marriage to Leleohoku appears to have been brief and unhappy. Contemporary accounts suggest that NAHIENAENA continued to meet secretly with her brother, unable to break the emotional and possibly physical bond that had developed between them. The stress of maintaining this double life, combined with the guilt instilled by her Christian education, continued to take its toll on her health. In 1836, NAHIENAENA became pregnant, and rumors immediately began circulating about the identity of the father, If the child was Leleohoku's, it would represent a victory for the missionary position and perhaps the beginning of a new generation of Hawaiian royalty raised according to Christian principles. But if Kamehameha III was the father, it would confirm the missionaries' worst fears about the persistence of heathen practices within the royal family. The pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. NAHIENAENA suffered from what contemporary sources describe as severe morning sickness, fatigue, and periods of mental distress that may have been related to the stress of her situation. As her condition progressed, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Hawaiian traditional healers and the few Western doctors available on the islands could offer little help. The child was born in September 1836, but lived only a few hours. Contemporary accounts describe the infant as severely deformed, though the exact nature of the deformities was not recorded in detail. The brief descriptions that survive suggest abnormalities that might have been consistent with genetic disorders resulting from inbreeding, though other causes cannot be ruled out. NAHIENAENA never recovered from the childbirth. She lingered for several months, growing progressively weaker and more withdrawn. The missionaries who had once celebrated her conversion now watched helplessly as she slipped away from both their influence and the world itself. She died on December 30, 1836, at the age of 21, leaving behind a kingdom forever changed by the cultural collision she had embodied. The princess's death marked more than the end of an individual life. It symbolized the broader collapse of traditional Hawaiian society under the pressure of Western contact. The population of native Hawaiians had already begun the devastating decline that would continue throughout the 19th century, caused by disease, cultural disruption, and the loss of traditional ways of life that had sustained the island's people for over a millennium. Modern medical historians have speculated about the causes of both NAHIENAENA's personal suffering and the broader demographic catastrophe that befell the Hawaiian people during this period. Some have suggested that the traditional practice of sibling marriage among the alii may have contributed to genetic vulnerabilities that made the royal family particularly susceptible to the diseases introduced by Western contact. The genetic isolation of Polynesian populations, combined with centuries of preferential marriage within chiefly bloodlines, might have created what scientists call a founder effect, reducing genetic diversity and increasing the frequency of harmful recessive alleles. When these populations were suddenly exposed to new pathogens and environmental stresses, their reduced genetic resilience may have made them especially vulnerable to demographic collapse. NAHIENAENA's story thus becomes a microcosm of larger historical forces: the collision between indigenous and Western cultures, the biological consequences of genetic isolation, and the personal costs paid by individuals caught between irreconcilable worlds. Her brief life illuminated the tragic gap between the idealized purity that royal inbreeding was supposed to preserve and the biological and cultural fragility it often created instead. In death, she became a symbol for those who mourned the passing of traditional Hawaiian culture, while also serving as a cautionary tale for those who sought to reform indigenous practices according to Western standards. Her legacy reminds us that the costs of cultural transformation are often borne most heavily by those who, through accident of birth, find themselves at the center of historical forces they cannot control. Joanna of Castile, La Loca. In the golden twilight of medieval Spain, as the Reconquista reached its triumphant conclusion and Christopher Columbus prepared to sail toward unknown horizons, a princess was born, whose troubled life would cast the first shadows over what would become Europe's most systematically inbred royal dynasty. Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, Joan the Mad, entered the world in 1479, carrying in her blood the converging streams of Spanish royalty that would, over the following centuries, create a genetic bottleneck of unprecedented severity. Her parents, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, were themselves cousins, sharing great-grandparents from the Trastamara dynasty that had ruled both kingdoms with varying degrees of success and stability. Their marriage in 1469 had united two of Iberia's most powerful realms, creating the foundation for what would become the Spanish Empire. But beneath the political triumph lay a genetic time bomb, as the repeated intermarriages within Spanish nobility had already begun to concentrate potentially harmful genes within the royal bloodline. The Trastamara family had a history of what contemporary observers euphemistically called melancholy and strange humors. Modern historians, analyzing the fragmentary medical records and contemporary descriptions that survive, have identified patterns of behavior that suggest possible bipolar disorder, depression, and other mental health conditions running through multiple generations of the dynasty. Whether these conditions had genetic components, environmental causes, or some combination of both remains a subject of scholarly debate. Joanna's childhood at the itinerant Spanish court provided little stability or emotional security. Her parents were constantly traveling, fighting wars, and managing the complex politics of their newly unified kingdoms. The young princess received an excellent education. She was fluent in Latin, spoke several modern languages, and showed considerable intellectual ability, but she also displayed signs of the emotional instability that would later define her life. Contemporary accounts describe Joanna as highly intelligent but prone to dramatic mood swings, periods of intense religious devotion alternating with apparent indifference to spiritual matters, and an emotional intensity that made those around her uncomfortable. Whether these traits were early manifestations of mental illness, normal adolescent behavior magnified by the pressures of royal life, or some combination of both, they would prove prophetic of her later difficulties. In 1496, at the age of 16, Joanna was married to Philip the Handsome, son of Maximilian I of Austria and Mary of Burgundy. The marriage was intended to cement an alliance between Spain and the Habsburg territories that would surround France and limit the power of the Spanish monarch's traditional enemy. From a diplomatic perspective, the union was a masterpiece of strategic planning. From a genetic standpoint, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Philip himself carried the accumulated genetic legacy of generations of Habsburg into marriage. His grandmother had been a Portuguese princess whose ancestry included multiple loops back to common ancestors. His great-grandmother had married her own uncle. His family tree, when carefully charted, resembled not so much a tree as a ladder, with each generation connected to the previous one through an increasingly narrow range of genetic relationships. The marriage between Joanna and Philip combined these two streams of concentrated heredity Spanish Trastamara and Austrian Habsburg, creating what geneticists would later recognize as one of the most dangerous genetic combinations in European royal history. Their children would inherit not just two sets of royal titles, but two sets of potentially harmful recessive genes, doubling the likelihood of genetic disorders with each birth. Initially, the marriage appeared successful. Philip was genuinely handsome, hence his epithet, and Joanna was reported to be passionately in love with him. They had 6 children in rapid succession, including the future Charles V, who would rule the largest empire in European history. But beneath the surface of dynastic success, troubling signs were already emerging. Joanna's behavior became increasingly erratic as the marriage progressed. She displayed what contemporary observers called excessive jealousy toward Philip's mistresses, not unusual for royal wives, but notable for its intensity and public nature. She alternated between periods of deep depression and manic activity, sometimes refusing to eat for days, other times engaging in frenzied religious observances that alarmed even the devoutly Catholic Spanish court. The birth of each child seemed to exacerbate rather than alleviate Joanna's emotional difficulties. Several of the pregnancies were difficult, and she appeared to suffer from what modern medicine would recognize as severe postpartum depression. Contemporary physicians, working with the limited understanding of their time, prescribed various treatments ranging from bloodletting to exorcism, none of which provided lasting relief. Philip's own behavior during this period suggests that he too may have inherited some of the psychological instabilities that ran in Habsburg bloodlines. He was reportedly prone to sudden rages, periods of apparent confusion, and what courtiers described as strange fancies. Modern historians have speculated that he may have suffered from bipolar disorder or another mood disorder, though the evidence is too fragmentary to reach definitive conclusions. The political dimensions of Joanna's condition became apparent when her mother Isabella died in 1504, making Joanna the rightful Queen of Castile. Philip immediately declared himself King of Castile by right of marriage, ignoring both Spanish law and his wife's legitimate claims. The dispute that followed revealed the extent to which Joanna's mental state had become a political liability, as Philip's supporters argued that she was too unstable to rule effectively. The struggle over the Castilian succession exposed Joanna to unprecedented stress at precisely the moment when she was least equipped to handle it. Contemporary accounts describe her as becoming increasingly withdrawn and paranoid, convinced that her husband and his advisors were plotting against her. Whether these fears were delusions brought on by mental illness or rational responses to very real political threats remains unclear, but they further damaged her reputation and effectiveness as a ruler. Philip's sudden death in 1506, at the age of only 28, precipitated the final collapse of Joanna's mental stability. She refused to allow his body to be buried, insisting that he was merely sleeping and would soon awaken. She traveled throughout Castile with his coffin, stopping only at night because, she claimed, it was improper for a widow to be seen in public during daylight hours. These behaviors, while perhaps interpretable as extreme grief reactions, convinced observers that she had indeed lost her sanity. The legend of Joanna's madness, which grew in the telling over subsequent centuries, may have obscured the very real political calculations that led to her imprisonment. Her father Ferdinand, and later her son Charles, found it convenient to have her declared incompetent to rule, as this allowed them to exercise power in her name without the complications that would have arisen from an active, legitimate queen. Whether Joanna was truly as incapacitated as her jailers claimed, or whether her madness was at least partially manufactured for political purposes, remains one of the great mysteries of Spanish history. From 1509 until her death in 1555, Joanna lived in isolation at the castle of Tordesillas, a prisoner of her own family and her own reputation. The conditions of her confinement were comfortable by the standards of the time. She had servants, adequate food, and access to books, but she was effectively cut off from the world beyond her castle walls. Visitors described her as sometimes lucid and intelligent, other times apparently lost in private worlds of grief and fantasy. The decades of isolation took their inevitable toll. Contemporary accounts suggest that whatever mental health issues Joanna may have had initially were certainly exacerbated by years of confinement and separation from her children. She developed what modern physicians would probably diagnose as severe depression, marked by periods of refusing to eat, neglecting personal hygiene, and expressing elaborate delusions about the state of the outside world. Yet even in her imprisonment, Joanna remained a figure of political significance. Her very existence legitimized the rule of her descendants, while her incapacity justified their control of that legitimacy. The paradox of her position simultaneously, the source and the victim of royal authority, would become a recurring theme in the history of the Habsburg dynasty. Modern genetic analysis has suggested that Joanna's mental health problems may indeed have had a hereditary component. Several of her descendants, including her great-grandson Don Carlos and her great-great-grandson Rudolph II, displayed similar patterns of psychological instability. The Habsburg tendency toward depression, paranoia, and what contemporary observers called melancholy became so pronounced that it was eventually recognized as a familial trait. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Joanna's story lies in the impossibility of separating her personal suffering from the political uses to which that suffering was put. Whether she was genuinely mentally ill, a victim of political manipulation, or some combination of both. She became a symbol of the dangers inherent in the concentration of power within bloodlines that might carry genetic vulnerabilities alongside genetic authority. Her life marked the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the Habsburg dynasty. The marriage of close relatives, producing children who inherited not just titles and territories, but also the accumulated genetic burden of generations of inbreeding. Each subsequent generation would face higher risks of mental illness, physical deformity, and reproductive failure, even as their political power reached unprecedented heights. Joanna died at Tordesillas in 1555, having outlived both her husband and her father, and having seen her son Charles become the most powerful ruler in European history. But her true legacy lay not in the empire. Her descendants would rule, but in the genetic inheritance. They would carry a burden of accumulated mutations and concentrated recessive traits that would eventually bring about the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line. In death, she became both a cautionary tale and a tragic figure, remembered as much for her madness as for her legitimate claims to royal authority. Her story reminds us that the very practices intended to preserve royal bloodlines could also poison them, creating genetic time bombs that would explode generations later in the form of sterility, insanity, and death. Catherine of Austria, double cousin, Queen of Portugal. In the intricate tapestry of European royal marriages, few unions were as genetically concentrated as that between Catherine of Austria and João III of Portugal in 1525. Catherine was the daughter of Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile, inheriting the converging bloodlines of Habsburg Austria and Trastamara Spain. Her husband was her double first cousin, sharing not one but two sets of great-grandparents, creating a marriage that combined royal bloodlines with mathematical precision and biological recklessness. To understand the full implications of Catherine's pedigree, one must trace the tangled genealogical web that produced her. Her father Philip had brought Habsburg genes concentrated through generations of strategic marriages within the Holy Roman Empire. Her mother Joanna carried the Trastamara inheritance, itself already inbred through repeated cousin marriages within Spanish nobility. When these two genetic streams combined in Catherine, the result was a princess whose ancestry, when charted by modern genealogists, shows a dramatic collapse in genetic diversity, where a typical person of Catherine's era might trace their lineage back to 32 distinct great-great-grandparents. Catherine's family tree collapsed to perhaps 8 unique individuals occupying those ancestral positions. This represented an inbreeding coefficient that approached levels typically seen only in isolated populations or laboratory breeding programs. Yet rather than recognizing this as a warning sign, European royalty celebrated such marriages as the ultimate expression of noble purity. Catherine grew up in the Low Countries, part of the vast Habsburg inheritance that her brother Charles V was assembling into the largest empire Europe had ever seen. Her education was thorough and sophisticated. She spoke Latin, French, Spanish, and Portuguese fluently, showed considerable skill in music and art, and demonstrated the kind of intellectual ability that seemed to run in Habsburg bloodlines alongside their various genetic problems. But even as a young woman, Catherine displayed some of the physical characteristics that were becoming increasingly common in Habsburg families. Contemporary portraits show her with the slightly protruding lower jaw that would eventually become known as the Habsburg jaw or Austrian lip, while not yet as pronounced as it would become in later generations. The feature was already noticeable enough to be recorded by court artists who typically idealized their royal subjects. The marriage negotiations between Catherine and João III began when she was still a child, driven by the complex diplomatic needs of the Habsburg Empire. Portugal controlled crucial trade routes to India and Brazil, possessing wealth that could finance Charles V's constant wars against France and the Ottoman Empire. Marriage between Catherine and the Portuguese king would cement an alliance while keeping Portugal's riches within the extended Habsburg family circle. What made the union particularly attractive from a Habsburg perspective was that João III was not a foreign ruler who might dilute royal bloodlines, but rather Catherine's double first cousin. His grandparents, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, were also Catherine's great-grandparents through her mother Joanna. This meant that the marriage would concentrate rather than disperse Habsburg genetic inheritance, producing children who would be even more purely royal than their parents. The wedding took place in 1525, when Catherine was 22 and João was 23. Contemporary accounts describe it as a magnificent affair, with celebrations that lasted for weeks and attracted nobility from across Europe. The bride was praised for her beauty, intelligence, and piety, while the groom was noted for his learning and his commitment to expanding Portuguese exploration and trade. Initially, the marriage appeared to fulfill all expectations. Catherine quickly adapted to Portuguese court life, learning the language and customs with the facility that seemed characteristic of Habsburg princesses. She proved herself an able patron of the arts and learning, supporting the construction of monasteries and churches, while also encouraging the Renaissance architectural styles that were transforming Lisbon into one of Europe's most beautiful capitals. But the true test of any royal marriage lay in its ability to produce healthy heirs, and here the biological consequences of Catherine and João's shared ancestry quickly became apparent. Their first child, Maria Manuela, was born in 1527 and appeared healthy, giving hope that the genetic risks of cousin marriage might be avoided. She would eventually marry Catherine's nephew Philip II of Spain, further concentrating the Habsburg bloodline. The couple's subsequent pregnancies, however, revealed the darker side of their genetic inheritance. Between 1528 and 1539, Catherine gave birth to 8 more children, but only one Prince João survived to adulthood, and he lived only until age 18. The others died in infancy or early childhood, displaying the pattern of high infant mortality that geneticists now recognize as a classic sign of inbreeding depression. Contemporary court physicians, working with the limited medical knowledge of their time, could offer no explanation for the tragic pattern of child deaths that plagued the Portuguese royal family. They prescribed various treatment special diets, bloodletting, prayers, and pilgrimages, but nothing could address the fundamental genetic incompatibilities that were likely responsible for the royal couple's reproductive difficulties. The psychological toll on Catherine was immense. Each pregnancy brought hope that was repeatedly crushed by infant death, creating a cycle of grief that deepened with each loss. Contemporary letters describe her as becoming increasingly religious and withdrawn, spending long hours in prayer and meditation as she struggled to understand why God seemed to be denying the Portuguese royal family the heirs it desperately needed. The political implications of the succession crisis extended far beyond Portugal itself. Charles V had counted on Portuguese support in his ongoing conflicts with France and the Ottoman Empire, but a kingdom without a clear heir was a potentially unstable ally. Rival claimants to the Portuguese throne began positioning themselves for a succession dispute, while foreign powers calculated how they might benefit from Portuguese weakness. Catherine's response to these mounting pressures revealed both her Habsburg determination and the psychological fragility that seemed to accompany intensive royal inbreeding. She threw herself into religious patronage with an intensity that bordered on obsession, funding the construction of elaborate monasteries and churches as if architectural grandeur might compensate for biological failure. The most famous of these projects was the Jerónimos Monastery in Belém, which Catherine expanded into one of the finest examples of Manueline architecture in Portugal. The intricate stone carvings that decorate its facades and cloisters reflect the complex cultural fusion that characterized Portugal during its golden age of exploration. but they also serve as monuments to royal grief, built with the desperate energy of parents who had lost too many children. As the years passed and Catherine's childbearing years waned, the genetic consequences of royal inbreeding became increasingly apparent, not just in Portugal but throughout the Habsburg territories. Her brother, Charles V, was struggling with his own health problems, including what modern physicians suspect was temporal lobe epilepsy and severe depression. Her nephews and nieces were displaying various physical abnormalities and mental health issues that suggested the accumulation of harmful genetic mutations. The pattern of problems was becoming too consistent to ignore, even by royal families who had strong incentives to deny that anything was wrong. Court physicians across Europe began to whisper about the possible connections between close-kin marriage and royal health problems, though they lacked the scientific framework to understand the mechanisms involved. Catherine's later years were marked by increasing physical frailty and what contemporary observers described as melancholy. Modern historians, analyzing the available evidence, have suggested that she may have suffered from depression, possibly exacerbated by the hormonal changes associated with multiple pregnancies and infant deaths. Her letters from this period reveal a woman increasingly focused on spiritual rather than worldly concerns, as if she had given up hope of earthly happiness. When João III died in 1557, Catherine faced the prospect of serving as regent for her surviving grandson Sebastian, who was only 3 years old at the time. The regency would have given her significant political power, but she declined the role, choosing instead to retreat to a religious life that reflected her growing conviction that worldly concerns were ultimately meaningless. Catherine died in 1578, the same year that her grandson Sebastian was killed in the disastrous Battle of Alcácer Quibir in Morocco. Her death marked the end of an era for both Portugal and the Habsburg dynasty, as the Portuguese succession crisis that followed would eventually lead to Spanish annexation of Portugal under Philip II. But perhaps Catherine's most lasting legacy lay in what her reproductive history revealed about the biological costs of royal inbreeding. The marriage that had seemed so politically advantageous in 1525 had produced a genetic catastrophe that weakened not just the Portuguese royal family, but the entire Iberian Peninsula. The children who might have ruled Portugal and maintained its independence died in their cribs, victims of genetic incompatibilities that their parents could neither understand nor prevent. Modern genetic analysis has confirmed what contemporary observers could only suspect, that marriages between double first cousins carry extraordinary risks of producing children with serious genetic disorders. The inbreeding coefficient of such unions approaches 0.25, meaning that the offspring have a 1 in 4 chance of inheriting identical copies of any given gene from both parents. When those genes carry harmful mutations, the results can be catastrophic. Catherine's story thus serves as both a historical tragedy and a scientific cautionary tale, illustrating how the pursuit of political purity through genetic concentration could lead to biological disaster. Her marriage had been celebrated as the ultimate expression of royal breeding, but it produced instead a generation of children too genetically compromised to survive, let alone rule. The genetic burden she and João III passed to their descendants would echo through European royal families for centuries to come. Anna of Austria, niece bride to Philip II. In the shadowed halls of the Alcazar in Madrid, where the weight of empire pressed down like the Spanish heat of summer, a young woman arrived in 1570 to fulfill a destiny that had been written in the careful calculations of dynastic politics and the desperate needs of royal succession. Anna of Austria was 15 years old, bright-eyed and hopeful, carrying with her the concentrated bloodlines of the Habsburg dynasty and the enormous responsibility of providing Spain with the male heir that had eluded Philip II through 2 previous marriages. Anna's journey to the Spanish throne had begun not with romance, but with the meticulous genealogical calculations that governed Habsburg marriage policy. She was the daughter of Maximilian II, Holy Roman Emperor, and Maria of Spain, making her simultaneously Philip II's niece through her mother and his second cousin through her father. More importantly, from a genetic standpoint, she represented the convergence of Austrian and Spanish Habsburg bloodlines that had been carefully maintained through generations of strategic inbreeding. The political necessity driving Anna's marriage was stark and urgent. Philip II, the most powerful monarch in Europe, controller of an empire that spanned from Peru to the Philippines, faced a crisis that no amount of gold from the Americas could solve. He was 43 years old and had no surviving male heir. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, had died giving birth to the unfortunate Don Carlos, whose physical and mental abnormalities had made him unsuitable for rule. His second wife, Mary I of England, had died childless after a series of phantom pregnancies that may themselves have been related to the genetic consequences of her own royal inbreeding. The Habsburg marriage strategy had always balanced political necessity with genetic concentration, but by Philip II's time, the biological costs of this approach were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Don Carlos, Philip's only surviving son from his first marriage, displayed a constellation of problems that contemporary observers attributed to various causes, but which modern geneticists would recognize as consistent with severe inbreeding depression. The prince suffered from what court physicians described as strange humors and melancholic dispositions that manifested in violent rages, apparent learning disabilities, and behavioral patterns so erratic that his own father eventually had him imprisoned for the safety of the realm. Whether Don Carlos's problems stemmed primarily from genetic factors, environmental trauma, or some combination of both, his condition made it clear that the Spanish succession needed an alternative. Anna represented that alternative, bringing not just her youth and fertility but also what Habsburg geneticists, if such specialists had existed, would have recognized as a particularly concentrated dose of royal genes. Her ancestry showed the characteristic collapse of genetic diversity that marked all Habsburg marriages, where a normal person might have 8 distinct great-grandparents. Anna could trace her lineage to perhaps 4 unique individuals, occupying those positions. The papal dispensation required for Anna's marriage to her uncle took months to negotiate, involving detailed theological arguments about the degrees of relationship permitted under canon law. The Church's eventual approval came with conditions and warnings about the spiritual dangers of such close-kin unions, but political necessity ultimately trumped religious concerns. The Spanish Empire needed an heir, and Anna offered the best available combination of genetic purity and reproductive potential. When Anna arrived in Madrid in 1570, she entered a court that was simultaneously the most powerful and the most troubled in Europe. The wealth flowing from Spanish America had created unprecedented luxury and artistic patronage, but it had also funded endless wars that drained the royal treasury as quickly as the treasure fleets could fill it. The burden of governing such a vast empire while maintaining the religious orthodoxy that Philip II saw as his sacred duty created stresses that affected every aspect of court life. Anna herself appears to have been initially overwhelmed by the complexities of Spanish court protocol and the weight of expectations placed upon her. Contemporary accounts describe her as intelligent and well-educated, with the linguistic abilities that were standard among Habsburg princesses, but also as shy and somewhat intimidated by her formidable husband and his elaborate court rituals. The marriage was consummated soon after the wedding ceremony, and within months Anna was pregnant, raising hopes throughout the Spanish Empire that the succession crisis might finally be resolved. But the pregnancy ended in miscarriage, the first of what would become a tragic pattern of reproductive failure that echoed her sister-in-law Catherine of Austria's experience in Portugal. Anna's subsequent pregnancies revealed the cruel mathematics of Habsburg genetics. She conceived regular court records suggest she was pregnant almost continuously during the first decade of her marriage, but most of these pregnancies ended in miscarriage or infant death. The few children who survived birth often lived only for days or weeks, displaying physical abnormalities that court physicians could neither explain nor treat. The most successful of Anna's pregnancies produced Philip III in 1578, but even this apparent triumph was shadowed by concerns about the child's health and development. Philip III survived to adulthood and eventually inherited the Spanish throne, but he displayed many of the characteristics that were becoming standard features of Habsburg royalty: the protruding jaw, a tendency toward melancholy and indecision, and what contemporary observers described as a weak constitution. Anna's other children who survived infancy included Isabella, Clara, Eugenia, and Catherine Michelle, both of whom would carry the Habsburg genetic inheritance into the next generation through marriages to close relatives. Isabella would marry her first cousin Albert VII of Austria, while Catherine would marry her first cousin Charles Emmanuel I of Savoy, ensuring that the genetic concentration that had produced their own health problems would continue in their descendants. The psychological toll of Anna's reproductive struggles was compounded by the rigid protocols of Spanish court life, which offered little emotional support for personal grief. Spanish royal women were expected to bear their sufferings with the same stoic dignity that Spanish soldiers displayed in battle, treating personal loss as a form of religious penance rather than grounds for sympathy or comfort. Contemporary letters and diary entries from court observers suggest that Anna increasingly found solace in religious devotion, spending long hours in prayer and meditation as she sought to understand why God seemed to be testing the Spanish royal family so severely. Her patronage of religious institutions increased with each pregnancy loss, as if architectural magnificence and charitable works might compensate for biological failure. The court physicians who attended Anna during her numerous pregnancies were working with medical knowledge that was sophisticated for its time, but utterly inadequate for understanding the genetic factors that were likely responsible for her reproductive difficulties. They prescribed various treatments based on the theory of humor special diets, bloodletting, herbal remedies, and carefully timed activities designed to balance the supposed hot and cold elements in her body. Some of these treatments may actually have been harmful, particularly the bloodletting that was commonly prescribed for pregnant women experiencing complications. Modern medical knowledge suggests that Anna's repeated miscarriages and infant deaths were probably caused by genetic incompatibilities that no medical intervention of her era could have addressed. But the futile search for medical solutions may have added physical stress to her already considerable emotional burden. Anna's health appears to have deteriorated significantly during her childbearing years, with contemporary accounts describing her as frequently ill and increasingly frail. Modern historians have speculated that she may have suffered from anemia, possibly caused by the repeated bloodletting treatments, or from what would now be recognized as postpartum depression following her numerous pregnancy losses. The political implications of Anna's reproductive struggles extended far beyond the Spanish court itself. The uncertainty surrounding the Spanish succession encouraged rebellions in the Netherlands, emboldened Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean, and complicated Spanish relations with other European powers who were calculating how they might benefit from a potential succession crisis. Philip II's response to these mounting pressures revealed both his Habsburg determination and the psychological strain that seemed to accompany the burdens of imperial rule combined with genetic isolation. He became increasingly focused on religious orthodoxy and imperial control, as if political and spiritual purity might compensate for the biological failures that threatened his dynasty's future. When Anna died in 1580 at the age of 31, she left behind a mixed legacy that would define the Spanish Habsburg experience for generations to come. She had successfully produced a male heir in Philip III, ensuring the continuation of the Spanish royal line. But the genetic burden she passed to her children would become increasingly apparent, as they matured and married their own close relatives. Modern genetic analysis has revealed that Anna's marriage to Philip II represented one of the most concentrated examples of royal inbreeding in European history. With an inbreeding coefficient approaching 0.25, their children faced genetic risks comparable to those seen in closed laboratory populations bred for experimental purposes. That any of their offspring survived to adulthood and reproduction was, from a purely biological standpoint, remarkably fortunate. Anna's story thus illustrates both the political necessity and the biological dangers of the Habsburg marriage strategy. Her union with Philip II had provided the Spanish Empire with the heir it desperately needed, but at a genetic cost that would become increasingly apparent in subsequent generations. The very practices that were intended to preserve royal bloodlines pure and powerful were also filling them with accumulated genetic damage that would eventually prove fatal. Isabella, Clara Eugenia, Infanta Governor. In the autumn light, filtering through the tall windows of the ducal palace in Brussels, Isabella Clara Eugenia stood before a map of Europe that showed her inheritance in stark black ink. The Spanish Netherlands, a collection of provinces torn by religious war, economic disruption, and political rebellion. She was 33 years old, daughter of Philip II of Spain and Anna of Austria, and she had just become co-sovereign of one of Europe's most troubled territories, alongside her husband Albert VII of Austria, who was also her first cousin. Isabella's path to power had been shaped by the biological realities that increasingly governed Habsburg succession planning. As the daughter of Philip II's problematic marriage to his niece Anna, she carried the concentrated genetic inheritance of multiple generations of Habsburg inbreeding. Her brother Philip III had inherited the Spanish throne, but his own health problems and the pattern of infant mortality that plagued Habsburg families had made it clear that the dynasty needed alternative sources of legitimacy and leadership. The marriage between Isabella and Albert in 1599 represented both a political masterstroke and a genetic gamble that would have profound consequences for the future of the Low Countries. Albert was the son of Archduke Charles II of Austria and Maria Anna of Bavaria, making him Isabella's first cousin through her father's side. Their union would further concentrate the Habsburg bloodline while attempting to resolve the political crisis that had consumed the Netherlands for decades. Isabella's childhood in the Spanish court had prepared her for the complexities of governing a fractured territory. She had received the comprehensive education typical of Habsburg princesses, mastering Latin, French, Italian, and German alongside her native Spanish. More importantly, she had observed firsthand how her father Philip II managed the complex web of territories, rebellions, and religious conflicts that defined the Spanish Empire at its height. But Isabella's education had also exposed her to the darker realities of Habsburg genetics. She had witnessed the tragic fate of her half-brother Don Carlos, whose mental and physical abnormalities had made him unsuitable for rule. She had seen her mother Anna struggle through pregnancy after pregnancy, most ending in miscarriage or infant death. She understood, perhaps better than previous generations of Habsburg royalty, that royal blood was not the uncomplicated blessing that dynastic propaganda portrayed. The physical signs of Habsburg inbreeding were already visible in Isabella's generation, though not yet as pronounced as they would become in later decades. Contemporary portraits show her with a slightly elongated face and the beginning of the protruding lower jaw that would become the dynasty's most recognizable feature. Court physicians noted that she was frequently ill during her youth, suffering from what they described as weak constitution and delicate health. These health problems became more pronounced as Isabella entered her childbearing years. Her marriage to Albert produced no surviving children despite multiple pregnancies, a pattern that was becoming disturbingly common among Habsburg couples. Contemporary medical records, fragmentary though they are, suggest that Isabella suffered several miscarriages and may have given birth to at least one child who died in infancy. The psychological impact of these reproductive failures was compounded by the political pressure surrounding Isabella's position as co-sovereign of the Spanish Netherlands. The territories she and Albert governed had been in revolt against Spanish rule for decades, driven by religious differences, economic grievances, and political aspirations for greater autonomy. The success of their joint rule depended partly on their ability to produce heirs who could provide stability and continuity for the region. Yet despite these personal tragedies, Isabella proved herself an exceptionally capable ruler whose political skills compensated for her biological difficulties. She understood that governing the Netherlands required a different approach than the centralized authoritarianism that characterized Spanish rule elsewhere. The Dutch provinces had strong traditions of local autonomy and religious diversity that needed to be accommodated rather than suppressed. Isabella's religious policies reflected this pragmatic approach to governance. While she remained personally devout and committed to Catholic orthodoxy, she recognized that the survival of Spanish rule in the Netherlands depended on finding some accommodation with Protestant subjects. She pursued policies of limited toleration that were controversial in Madrid, but essential for maintaining peace in her territories. The economic policies she and Albert implemented revealed a sophisticated understanding of the commercial foundations of Dutch prosperity. Rather than simply extracting wealth for the Spanish treasury, they encouraged trade and manufacturing that would make their territories more valuable and more stable. Isabella personally involved herself in negotiations with merchant guilds and banking houses, displaying the kind of detailed economic knowledge that was unusual among royal women of her era. These administrative successes made Isabella's reproductive failures even more poignant from a political standpoint. She had proven that Habsburg women could be effective rulers in their own right, but the genetic burden she carried made it impossible for her to pass these capabilities to biological heirs. The very bloodline that gave her political legitimacy also condemned her to biological sterility. The cultural patronage that marked Isabella's reign in Brussels reflected both her personal interests and her political needs. She supported artists, writers, and musicians who could enhance the prestige of her court while also promoting the Spanish cultural influence that helped legitimize her rule. The Baroque artistic style that flourished under her patronage combined Spanish religious themes with Flemish technical mastery, creating a distinctive cultural synthesis. Peter Paul Rubens, the greatest of the Flemish Baroque artists, became closely associated with Isabella's court, producing paintings that celebrated both her personal virtue and her political achievements. These works often featured religious and mythological themes that subtly reinforced the legitimacy of Spanish rule while appealing to local artistic traditions. Rubens's diplomatic missions on behalf of Isabella's government demonstrated how cultural patronage could serve political purposes in an era when artistic prestige translated directly into political influence. The architecture commissioned during Isabella's reign similarly balanced Spanish imperial symbolism with local traditions and practical needs. The churches, public buildings, and fortifications constructed under her authority were designed to be both beautiful and functional, serving the spiritual and defensive needs of her subjects while displaying the wealth and power of Spanish rule. But perhaps Isabella's most significant cultural legacy lay in her support for educational institutions that combined religious instruction with practical training. She founded schools and academies that trained administrators, diplomats, and military officers who could serve the complex needs of governing a multilingual, multi-confessional territory. These institutions helped create a cadre of officials who were loyal to Spanish rule, but also understood local conditions and customs. As Isabella aged, and it became clear that she would have no biological heirs, the question of succession for the Spanish Netherlands became increasingly urgent. Her personal tragedy became a political crisis that would ultimately determine the future of one of Europe's most economically important regions. The genetic factors that had made her biologically sterile would eventually contribute to the political instability that led to the final loss of the northern Netherlands to Spanish rule. Isabella's later years were marked by increasing religious devotion and what contemporary observers described as melancholy resignation to her fate. She spent growing amounts of time in prayer and meditation, perhaps seeking spiritual consolation for the biological and political failures that had marked her reign. Her correspondence from this period reveals a woman who had learned to find meaning in duty and service rather than in the personal fulfillment that had been denied her. When Albert died in 1621, Isabella faced the choice of remarrying to preserve the joint sovereignty arrangement or accepting a reduction in her political status. She chose to become a nun, taking religious vows that formally renounced any possibility of marriage or childbearing, while allowing her to continue governing as a Spanish appointee rather than as an independent sovereign. Isabella's death in 1633 marked the end of an experiment in Habsburg governance that had been both remarkably successful and ultimately tragic. She had proven that close-kin marriage could produce individuals capable of sophisticated political leadership, but she had also demonstrated the biological costs of such genetic concentration. Her reign had provided stability and prosperity for the Spanish Netherlands, but her inability to produce heirs had ensured that these achievements would not be sustainable. Modern genetic analysis suggests that Isabella's reproductive failures were almost certainly related to the extreme inbreeding that characterized her ancestry. With both parents carrying concentrated Habsburg genes and her husband representing another close genetic relationship, her children would have faced inbreeding coefficients that made survival to adulthood extremely unlikely. The mathematical probability of genetic disorders would have been so high that successful reproduction was more a matter of extraordinary luck than reasonable expectation. Isabella's legacy thus embodies the fundamental contradiction of Habsburg marriage policy. The same genetic concentration that legitimized royal authority also undermined the biological foundations of dynastic continuity. Her life demonstrated that Habsburg inbreeding could produce individuals of exceptional capability, but it also showed that these same individuals might be unable to pass their abilities to the next generation. Margaret of Austria, devout Queen of Spain. In the solemn magnificence of the Spanish court, where black silk and religious devotion had become the ultimate expressions of royal dignity, Margaret of Austria arrived in 1599 to marry Philip III and assume the burden of producing heirs for the most inbred dynasty in European history. She was 14 years old, daughter of Archduke Charles II of Austria and Mariana of Bavaria, and she brought with her not only the concentrated Habsburg bloodline, but also a religious fervor that would define both her personal life and her approach to the impossible genetics she had inherited. Margaret's marriage to Philip III represented yet another tightening of the Habsburg genetic spiral that had been winding ever more closely since the days of Joanna the Mad. Philip was her first cousin, son of Philip II and Anna of Austria, meaning that Margaret and her husband shared a set of grandparents and carried many of the same genetic variations that had been accumulating in Habsburg bloodlines for generations. Their union would produce children with inbreeding coefficients that pushed the mathematical limits of what human genetics could sustain. The young Archduchess had grown up in the court of her father Charles II, witnessing firsthand the consequences of Habsburg marriage practices. Charles himself had been the product of a first-cousin marriage and displayed many of the physical and mental characteristics that were becoming standard features of the dynasty: the elongated facial structure, the protruding lower jaw, and what contemporary observers diplomatically described as thoughtful melancholy, but which modern historians recognize as likely depression. Margaret's education had been thoroughly Habsburg in its combination of sophisticated intellectual training and intense religious instruction. She spoke Latin, German, Spanish, and Italian fluently, had studied mathematics and natural philosophy, and possessed the kind of broad cultural knowledge that enabled her to serve as an effective patron of arts and learning. But her education had also emphasized the spiritual dimensions of royal duty, particularly the obligation to bear and raise children who would serve both God and empire with equal devotion. The religious intensity that characterized Margaret's approach to life may have been partly a response to the biological challenges she faced as a Habsburg bride. Contemporary letters and diary entries suggest that she understood, at least intuitively, that her marriage to Philip III would require divine intervention to produce healthy heirs. Her devotional practices took on an urgency that went beyond conventional royal piety, as if she believed that sufficient spiritual preparation might overcome genetic obstacles. Margaret's arrival in Madrid coincided with a period of particular religious intensity in the Spanish court. Philip III, unlike his more pragmatic father Philip II, was deeply influenced by his confessors and spiritual advisors, who saw the king's role as primarily religious rather than political. This spiritual emphasis created a court atmosphere that was both devoutly Catholic and remarkably isolated from the practical realities of governing a global empire. The wedding ceremony itself reflected this religious focus, with elaborate rituals that emphasized the sacred nature of royal marriage and the divine sanction of Habsburg rule. Margaret was presented not merely as Philip's bride, but as a partner in the holy work of preserving Catholic monarchy against the Protestant and Islamic threats that surrounded Spain. The marriage was understood to be both a political alliance and a spiritual mission. Margaret's first pregnancy came quickly after the wedding, raising hopes throughout the Spanish Empire that the genetic problems that had plagued previous Habsburg generations might be overcome through prayer and divine favor. But the child, a daughter named Anna Mauricia, lived only 20 days, displaying the pattern of infant mortality that had become tragically familiar in Habsburg families. The death of her first child appears to have deepened Margaret's religious devotion, while also introducing her to the cruel mathematics of Habsburg genetics. Contemporary accounts describe her as spending increasing amounts of time in prayer and meditation, seeking to understand why God was testing the Spanish royal family so severely. Her spiritual advisors encouraged her to see these trials as opportunities for spiritual growth rather than biological failures. Margaret's subsequent pregnancies revealed the full extent of the genetic burden she and Philip III had inherited. Between 1,601 and 1,621, she gave birth to 8 children, but only 5 survived to adulthood, and several of those who did survive showed signs of the physical and mental problems that were becoming characteristic of Habsburg descendants. The pattern of miscarriages, infant deaths, and childhood disabilities was becoming too consistent to attribute to chance or divine displeasure. The children who did survive to maturity carried forward the Habsburg genetic inheritance with its accumulating burden of harmful mutations. The future Philip IV displayed the extreme version of the Habsburg jaw that would become the dynasty's most recognizable feature, along with respiratory problems that may have been related to the facial deformities. The Infanta Mariana showed signs of what contemporary physicians described as nervous disorders that modern doctors would probably classify as anxiety or mood disorders. Margaret's approach to child rearing reflected both her religious convictions and her growing understanding of her children's vulnerabilities. She insisted on personally supervising their education and spiritual development, creating daily schedules that balanced intellectual training with devotional exercises. Her letters to various confessors and spiritual advisors reveal a mother who was simultaneously proud of her children's accomplishments and deeply worried about their physical and mental fragility. The court physicians who attended Margaret during her numerous pregnancies were increasingly sophisticated in their understanding of hereditary factors, though they lacked the scientific framework to understand the mechanisms involved. They had observed the patterns of illness and disability that ran through Habsburg families, and some had begun to suspect that close kin marriages might be responsible for these problems. But the political and religious constraints of the Spanish court made it impossible for physicians to openly question the wisdom of Habsburg marriage practices. Instead, they focused on treating symptoms rather than addressing causes, prescribing increasingly elaborate regimens of diet, exercise, and spiritual discipline designed to strengthen royal constitutions that were fundamentally compromised by genetic factors beyond medical intervention. Margaret's own health deteriorated significantly during her childbearing years, with contemporary records describing her as frequently ill and increasingly frail. Modern medical historians have suggested that she may have suffered from anemia, possibly caused by repeated pregnancies and the bloodletting treatments that were standard medical practice of the era. Her letters from this period reveal chronic fatigue, frequent headaches, and what she described as sorrows of the heart that may have been symptoms of depression. The psychological burden of Margaret's reproductive struggles was compounded by the increasing isolation of the Spanish court from the rest of Europe. Philip III's focus on religious orthodoxy and court ceremony had reduced Spain's diplomatic flexibility and military effectiveness at precisely the moment when the empire faced new challenges from Dutch independence, French expansion, and Ottoman resurgence. The genetic weakening of the royal family was paralleled by the political weakening of the Spanish state. Margaret's response to these mounting pressures was to intensify her religious devotions and charitable works, as if personal sanctity might compensate for dynastic failure. She founded numerous convents and monasteries, patronized religious art and architecture, and maintained extensive correspondence with mystics and spiritual reformers throughout Catholic Europe. Her court became a center for religious revival that attracted saints, scholars, and visionaries from across the Catholic world. The artistic patronage that flourished under Margaret's influence reflected both her personal piety and her political needs. The Baroque style that dominated Spanish art during her reign combined religious themes with Habsburg dynastic symbolism, creating works that celebrated both divine authority and royal legitimacy. Artists like Diego Velázquez began their careers under Margaret's patronage, producing paintings that would define Spanish artistic achievement for centuries. But perhaps Margaret's most significant cultural legacy lay in her influence on Spanish religious life during a crucial period of Catholic renewal. Her support for mystical traditions and contemplative orders helped shape the distinctive character of Spanish Catholicism, while her patronage of educational institutions created new opportunities for religious and intellectual development throughout the Spanish territories. As Margaret aged and her childbearing years ended, the question of the Spanish succession became increasingly urgent. Her son, Philip IV, had inherited the throne, but his own marriage to his cousin Isabella of France had produced children who showed even more pronounced signs of Habsburg genetic deterioration. The mathematical progression of inbreeding was approaching levels that would make dynastic survival increasingly unlikely. Margaret's later years were marked by increasing withdrawal from worldly concerns and deeper immersion in spiritual life. She spent growing amounts of time in prayer and meditation, perhaps finding in religious contemplation the peace that had been denied her in the biological and political struggles of royal life. Her correspondence from this period reveals a woman who had learned to measure success in spiritual rather than dynastic terms. When Margaret died in 1611, at the age of 27, she left behind a complex legacy that reflected both the achievements and the limitations of Habsburg genetic concentration. She had successfully produced heirs for the Spanish throne, ensuring the continuation of the dynasty for another generation, but the genetic burden she passed to her children would become increasingly apparent as they matured and faced their own reproductive challenges. Modern genetic analysis has revealed that Margaret's marriage to Philip III represented one of the most concentrated examples of royal inbreeding in European history, with an inbreeding coefficient that approached the levels typically seen only in closed experimental populations. The fact that any of their children survived to adulthood was, from a purely biological standpoint, remarkably fortunate, but the genetic damage accumulated through generations of such marriages was becoming increasingly difficult for even divine intervention to overcome. Margaret's story thus illustrates the tragic irony of Habsburg marriage policy. The very practices that were intended to preserve royal bloodlines pure and powerful were also filling them with genetic time bombs that would eventually explode in the form of sterility, deformity, and death. Her deep religious faith had provided personal comfort and cultural inspiration, but it could not overcome the biological realities that her dynasty had created through centuries of systematic inbreeding. Mariana of Austria, aunt-wife, regent. In the twilight of Habsburg Spain, as the golden age of empire slowly faded into the grey shadows of decline, a 14-year-old girl arrived at the Alcazar in Madrid to marry her uncle and inherit the most dangerous genetic legacy in European history. Mariana of Austria, daughter of Emperor Ferdinand III, and Maria Anna of Spain, carried in her young body an inbreeding coefficient that exceeded 0.25, making her more closely related to her husband Philip IV than typical full siblings are to each other. The year was 1649, and the Spanish Empire, though still vast and wealthy, was beginning to show the strain of endless wars, economic mismanagement, and the biological deterioration of its ruling family. Philip IV, now in his middle age, had buried 2 previous wives and watched as his children died in infancy or displayed the increasingly severe genetic abnormalities that marked Habsburg descendants. His marriage to Mariana represented both a desperate attempt to secure the succession and a further tightening of the genetic noose that was slowly strangling his dynasty. Mariana's ancestry read like a catalogue of European royal inbreeding. Her father, Ferdinand III, was the son of Ferdinand II and Maria Anna of Bavaria, themselves cousins. Her mother, Maria Anna, was the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, yet another first-cousin marriage. This meant that Mariana carried genetic material from essentially the same small pool of ancestors that had been recycled through Habsburg bloodlines for over a century. The mathematical implications of Mariana's pedigree were staggering. Where a typical person might trace their ancestry to 16 distinct great-great-grandparents, Mariana's family tree collapsed to perhaps 6 unique individuals occupying those positions. She was simultaneously her husband's niece, second cousin, and third cousin through multiple lines, creating a concentration of shared genes that approached the levels found in inbred laboratory mouse colonies. Yet the political necessity driving this genetic catastrophe was undeniable. Philip IV needed a male heir, and Habsburg tradition dictated that such an heir should carry the purest possible royal blood. Foreign marriages had been tried in previous generations and had often produced political complications without solving the fundamental problem of succession. Marriage within the family, however genetically dangerous, seemed to offer the best chance of producing children who would be unquestionably legitimate and fully Habsburg. Mariana's wedding to Philip IV was a magnificent affair that attempted to mask the biological reality of the union behind layers of ceremony and religious symbolism. The bride, barely out of childhood, was presented as the salvation of the Spanish monarchy, the pure vessel through which God would provide the empire with the heir it desperately needed. The elaborate festivities lasted for weeks, with tournaments, ballets, and religious ceremonies that celebrated both the marriage and the divine sanction it supposedly carried. But beneath the pageantry lay a human tragedy of extraordinary dimensions. Mariana was marrying a man who was old enough to be her father and who had already demonstrated, through 2 previous marriages, the reproductive difficulties that plagued Habsburg families. Philip himself showed clear signs of the genetic burden he carried. The characteristic jaw deformity that made eating difficult, a tendency toward melancholy that bordered on clinical depression, and what court physicians described as a weak constitution that left him susceptible to frequent illness. The early years of Mariana's marriage were marked by the pattern of reproductive failure that had become tragically familiar in Habsburg families. She conceived quickly and regularly, but most of her pregnancies ended in miscarriage or infant death. The few children who survived birth often lived only for days or weeks, displaying physical abnormalities that court physicians could neither explain nor treat. The psychological toll on Mariana was immense. Contemporary accounts describe her as increasingly withdrawn and melancholic, spending long hours in prayer as she struggled to understand why God seemed to be denying the Spanish royal family the heirs it desperately needed. Her letters from this period reveal a young woman overwhelmed by the weight of dynastic expectations and her apparent inability to fulfill them. The court physicians who attended Mariana during her numerous troubled pregnancies were working with medical knowledge that was sophisticated for its time, but utterly inadequate for addressing the genetic factors that were likely responsible for her difficulties. They prescribed various treatments based on humoral theory, special diets, bloodletting, herbal remedies, but these interventions could not overcome the fundamental genetic incompatibilities that made successful reproduction increasingly unlikely. In 1661, after more than a decade of reproductive struggles, Mariana finally gave birth to a surviving son, Charles II, who would become the last Habsburg king of Spain. But even this apparent triumph was shadowed by immediate concerns about the child's health and development. Charles was born with severe physical deformities, including the extreme version of the Habsburg jaw that made nursing difficult and would eventually interfere with speech and eating. The infant prince also displayed developmental delays that became more pronounced as he grew older. He was slow to walk, talk, and reach other developmental milestones. Court physicians noted that he suffered from frequent seizures, possibly indicating epilepsy or other neurological disorders. Modern geneticists, analyzing the available historical evidence, have identified multiple conditions that Charles likely inherited as a result of his parents' extreme consanguinity. But Charles's birth, problematic though it was, had at least provided the Spanish succession with a male heir. Mariana's subsequent pregnancies produced a daughter, Maria Theresa, who survived to adulthood but displayed her own set of health problems, and several more children who died in infancy. The pattern of reproductive failure continued, but the immediate crisis of succession had been temporarily resolved. When Philip IV died in 1665, 4-year-old Charles II inherited the Spanish throne under the regency of his mother Mariana. This placed the 30-year-old queen in the position of governing the world's largest empire on behalf of a child whose genetic abnormalities made his future ability to rule increasingly questionable. The regency would last for 10 years, during which Mariana would demonstrate both remarkable political skill and the psychological strain of managing an impossible situation. As regent, Mariana faced challenges that would have tested even the most capable ruler. The Spanish Empire was in decline, facing military defeats in Europe, economic crisis at home, and rebellions in its overseas territories. The regent needed to manage complex diplomatic relationships, while also dealing with court factions that questioned both her authority and her son's fitness to eventually assume personal rule. Mariana's approach to governance revealed a sophisticated understanding of the political realities facing the Spanish monarchy. She sought to end the costly wars that had drained the royal treasury, negotiating treaties that traded territorial concessions for financial stability. She also attempted to reform the Spanish administrative system, recognizing that the empire's survival depended on more efficient and effective government. But Mariana's regency was complicated by the constant need to manage public concerns about Charles II's fitness for rule. As the young king grew older, his physical and mental limitations became increasingly apparent. He remained small for his age, had difficulty speaking clearly due to his jaw deformities, and displayed what contemporary observers described as simple-mindedness that made complex reasoning difficult. The question of Charles II's eventual marriage became a source of constant anxiety for Mariana and her advisors. The genetic factors that had made Charles himself such a compromised heir would make any marriage a genetic gamble of extraordinary proportions. Yet the dynasty's survival depended on Charles producing heirs, creating a situation in which biological impossibility and political necessity seemed to be in direct conflict. Mariana's own health deteriorated significantly during the stress of the regency years. Contemporary accounts describe her as frequently ill, suffering from what court physicians attributed to nervous exhaustion and melancholic humors. Modern historians have suggested that she may have suffered from depression, possibly exacerbated by the overwhelming responsibilities she bore, and the growing realization that her son might never be capable of effective rule. The cultural patronage that marked Mariana's regency reflected both her personal interests and her political needs. She supported artists and writers who could enhance the prestige of the Spanish court, while also promoting the legitimacy of Charles II's eventual personal rule. The Baroque artistic style that flourished during this period often featured themes of divine providence and royal destiny, as if artistic magnificence might compensate for biological failure. Religious devotion became increasingly central to Mariana's life, as the challenges of governing mounted and Charles's limitations became more apparent. She spent growing amounts of time in prayer and consultation with spiritual advisors, seeking divine guidance for decisions that seemed to have no good solutions. Her correspondence with various mystics and theologians reveals a woman searching for spiritual meaning in what appeared to be dynastic catastrophe. When Charles II assumed personal rule in 1675, Mariana's formal role as regent ended, but her influence over her son's reign continued until her death in 1696. She remained his closest advisor and the person most responsible for managing the practical difficulties created by his various disabilities. This included arranging his marriages, first to Marie-Louise d'Orléans and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg, both of which failed to produce the heirs that might have prevented the War of Spanish Succession. Mariana's later years were marked by increasing recognition that the Habsburg dynasty in Spain was approaching its end. Charles II's marriages had produced no children, and his various physical and mental problems made it unlikely that he would ever be capable of fathering healthy heirs. The genetic experiment that had begun with careful calculations about bloodline purity was ending in biological extinction. The irony of Mariana's position was complete. She had fulfilled her primary duty as a royal wife by producing a male heir, but the genetic burden she and Philip IV had passed to that heir made him incapable of continuing the dynasty. The very practices that were intended to preserve royal bloodlines had instead poisoned them with accumulated genetic damage that no amount of political skill or religious devotion could overcome. Modern genetic analysis has confirmed what contemporary observers could only suspect, that Charles II was likely the victim of multiple genetic disorders resulting from the extreme inbreeding of his ancestry. These may have included mental retardation, epilepsy, hormonal imbalances that affected his physical development, and immune system deficiencies that made him vulnerable to various infections. The mathematical probability of such problems, given his parents' inbreeding coefficient of over 0.25, was extremely high. Mariana's story thus represents both the culmination and the beginning of the end of the Habsburg genetic experiment. Her marriage to Philip IV had produced the heir that temporarily saved the Spanish succession, but the genetic cost of that salvation was so extreme that it ultimately doomed the dynasty to extinction. Her life embodied the tragic contradiction at the heart of royal inbreeding, the pursuit of genetic purity that led inexorably to genetic destruction. Margarita Theresa, Las Meninas, Infanta, in the shadowed splendor of the Alcazar's royal apartments, where Diego Velázquez was creating the masterpiece that would immortalize the Spanish court at its moment of greatest artistic achievement and biological decline. A small figure in elaborate court dress stood at the center of a composition that captured both the magnificence and the tragedy of Habsburg rule. Margarita Theresa, the 5-year-old Infanta who would become the subject of Las Meninas. carried in her delicate frame a genetic inheritance so concentrated that her family tree resembled not so much a branching network of ancestry as an hourglass, narrow at its waist, where the same few individuals appeared again and again across multiple generations. Born in 1651 to Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, Margarita entered the world as the product of an uncle-niece marriage that had pushed Habsburg inbreeding to unprecedented extremes. Her parents shared more genetic material than typical full siblings, creating an inbreeding coefficient that exceeded 0.25 and placed their children at extraordinary risk for the accumulated genetic disorders that had been building in Habsburg bloodlines for over a century. The world that greeted Margarita's birth was one of fading grandeur and mounting anxiety. The Spanish Empire, though still vast and wealthy, was showing increasing signs of military, economic, and administrative decline. More troubling still, the royal family itself seemed to be deteriorating, with each generation displaying more pronounced physical abnormalities and reproductive difficulties than the last. The infant princess represented both hope and fear. Hope that the dynasty might produce healthy heirs, fear that the genetic burden had become too great to bear. Velázquez's famous painting, completed when Margarita was about 5 years old, captures her at a moment when the full extent of her genetic inheritance was not yet apparent. She appears as a charming child surrounded by her attendants, dwarfs, and the artist himself, all arranged in a complex composition that celebrates the elaborate ceremonial culture of the Spanish court. But even in this idealized representation, careful observers can detect hints of the physical characteristics that were becoming standard features of Habsburg children. The princess displays the elongated facial structure that had become increasingly common in the dynasty, though not yet as extreme as it would become in her half-brother Charles II. Her posture and bearing suggest the careful training that royal children receive to compensate for physical limitations, while the elaborate clothing and ceremonial context emphasize the divine nature of royal authority rather than its biological foundations. But Las Meninas also serves as a document of a genetic experiment approaching its limits. The painting captures a moment when Habsburg artistic patronage had reached extraordinary heights, even as Habsburg biology was approaching catastrophic failure. The contrast between cultural achievement and genetic deterioration that characterizes Margarita's era reflects the complex legacy of royal inbreeding. It could produce individuals of remarkable ability, but it could also burden them with genetic problems that made normal life increasingly difficult. Margarita's childhood was structured around the elaborate protocols of Spanish court life, which had evolved to accommodate the special needs and limitations of Habsburg children. Her education emphasized languages, music, and religious instruction, but it also included careful attention to physical therapy and medical treatment, designed to address the various health problems that were becoming standard features of royal youth. Contemporary accounts describe Margarita as intelligent and well-educated, but also as frequently ill and physically delicate. Court physicians noted that she suffered from various ailments that modern doctors would probably recognize as symptoms of genetic disorders: breathing difficulties that may have been related to facial deformities, digestive problems that interfered with normal nutrition, and what were diplomatically described as nervous conditions that might have encompassed various neurological issues. The question of Margarita's eventual marriage became a source of constant anxiety for the Spanish court. Habsburg tradition dictated that she should marry within the family to preserve bloodline purity, but the genetic risks of further inbreeding were becoming impossible to ignore. At the same time, foreign marriages carried political risks that the declining Spanish Empire could ill afford. The princess found herself caught between biological impossibility and political necessity. The solution eventually chosen reflected both Habsburg genetic obsessions and the practical limitations imposed by the dynasty's shrinking gene pool. In 1666, at the age of 15, Margarita was married to her maternal uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, creating yet another uncle-niece union that would further concentrate the already dangerous Habsburg genetic inheritance. The wedding was celebrated as a triumph of diplomatic strategy that would strengthen the bonds between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family. Contemporary accounts praised the match as ensuring that Margarita's children would be purely Habsburg, untainted by foreign blood that might compromise their divine authority. But the genetic reality was far more troubling. Leopold I himself carried many of the same genetic variants that Margarita had inherited, meaning that their children would face inbreeding coefficients that approached the theoretical maximum. Margarita's journey from Madrid to Vienna for her wedding provided a final glimpse of the Spanish court culture that had shaped her childhood. The elaborate procession that accompanied her across Europe served both ceremonial and practical purposes, demonstrating Spanish wealth and power, while also providing the medical support that her delicate health required. Contemporary accounts describe frequent stops for rest and medical attention, suggesting that even the journey to her new home posed significant challenges for the young empress. Vienna, where Margarita would spend her brief adult years, offered a different version of Habsburg court culture, but many of the same genetic and political pressures that had defined her Spanish childhood. Leopold I himself displayed the characteristic Habsburg physical features in their most extreme form yet seen. A jaw so pronounced that it interfered with eating and speaking, along with various other deformities that court artists tactfully minimized in official portraits. The early years of Margarita's marriage were marked by the pattern of reproductive difficulties that had become tragically familiar in Habsburg families. She conceived regularly, but most of her pregnancies ended in miscarriage or infant death. The few children who survived birth often lived only briefly, displaying physical abnormalities so severe that contemporary accounts could barely describe them without violating the conventions of royal discretion. Contemporary medical records, fragmentary though they are, provide disturbing insights into the biological reality of Margarita's pregnancies. Court physicians noted unusually high rates of birth defects, including spina bifida, cleft palates, and various limb deformities that were likely caused by the extreme genetic concentration represented by her marriage to Leopold. The mathematical probability of such problems, given the parents' inbreeding coefficient, was extraordinarily high. The psychological toll of these repeated reproductive tragedies was compounded by the political pressure surrounding Margarita's position as empress. The survival of the Habsburg dynasty depended on her ability to produce healthy heirs. But the genetic factors that made this increasingly unlikely were beyond any medical intervention available in the 17th century. She found herself blamed for biological failures that were actually the inevitable result of centuries of systematic inbreeding. Margarita's response to these mounting pressures revealed both her Habsburg determination and the psychological fragility that seemed to accompany intensive royal inbreeding. Contemporary accounts describe her as increasingly religious and withdrawn, spending long hours in prayer as she sought to understand why God seemed to be testing the Habsburg family so severely. Her letters from this period reveal a young woman overwhelmed by responsibilities she could neither fulfill nor escape. The few children who survived infancy in Margarita's marriage carried forward the Habsburg genetic inheritance with its accumulating burden of harmful mutations. Her daughter, Maria Antonia, lived to adulthood, but displayed various health problems that were likely related to her extreme inbreeding, while other children died so young that their genetic problems were never fully documented. The cultural patronage that marked Margarita's brief career as empress reflected both her personal interests and her political needs. She supported artists and musicians who could enhance the prestige of the Vienna court, while also providing cultural justification for Habsburg claims to divine authority. The Baroque artistic style that flourished under her influence often featured religious themes that emphasized the sacred nature of royal bloodlines, as if artistic magnificence might compensate for biological failure. But perhaps Margarita's most significant cultural legacy lay in what her life revealed about the limitations of royal inbreeding. The same genetic concentration that was supposed to preserve divine authority was actually undermining the biological foundations of dynastic survival. The princess, who had been immortalized as a symbol of Habsburg grandeur in Las Meninas, was also serving as a living demonstration of the genetic catastrophe that systematic inbreeding could produce. Margarita's health deteriorated rapidly during her early 20s, as the accumulated stress of multiple difficult pregnancies combined with whatever genetic disorders she may have inherited. Contemporary accounts describe her as suffering from various ailments that court physicians could neither diagnose nor treat effectively. Modern medical historians have suggested that she may have suffered from autoimmune disorders, hormonal imbalances, or other conditions related to the extreme genetic concentration of her ancestry. When Margarita died in 1673, at the age of only 21, she left behind a complex legacy that embodied both the achievements and the ultimate failure of the Habsburg genetic experiment. She had been immortalized as a symbol of royal grandeur and cultural sophistication, but her brief life had also demonstrated the biological costs of pursuing genetic purity through systematic inbreeding. The children she left behind would carry the Habsburg genetic burden forward into the next generation, but with even more concentrated bloodlines and higher risks of genetic disorders. Her death marked not just the end of an individual life, but another step in the gradual extinction of a dynasty that had become too genetically compromised to survive. Modern genetic analysis has revealed that Margarita's marriage to Leopold I represented one of the most extreme examples of royal inbreeding in recorded history. Their inbreeding coefficient approached levels that would be considered dangerous even in carefully controlled laboratory breeding programs. The fact that any of their children survived to adulthood was, from a purely biological standpoint, remarkably fortunate, but the genetic damage accumulated through generations of such marriages was becoming impossible to overcome. Margarita's story thus serves as both artistic inspiration and scientific cautionary tale, illustrating how the pursuit of royal purity could lead to biological destruction. The little princess, who had charmed viewers of Las Meninas for centuries, was also a victim of one of history's most systematic experiments in genetic concentration. Her brief life, embodying both the cultural achievements and the ultimate failure of Habsburg marriage policy. Mariana of Austria, 1606, Empress of Central Europe. In the war-torn landscape of 17th century Central Europe, where the 30 Years' War had shattered the old certainties of religion and politics, a Habsburg princess found herself at the center of an empire, struggling to maintain both its territorial integrity and its genetic viability. Mariana of Austria, born in 1606 to Archduke Charles II of Styria and Mariana of Bavaria, would become Empress of the Holy Roman Empire through marriage to her first cousin Ferdinand III, adding another layer to the complex genetic tapestry that was slowly strangling the Habsburg dynasty. The world into which Mariana was born was one of mounting religious and political crisis. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the unity of Christian Europe, creating a complex web of alliances and conflicts that would eventually explode into the devastating war that would define her adult life. But beneath these visible political tensions lay the less obvious but equally dangerous biological crisis that was developing within the Habsburg bloodlines through generations of systematic inbreeding. Mariana's ancestry embodied the characteristic genetic concentration that marked all Habsburg marriages of her era. Her father, Charles II, was the son of Archduke Ferdinand II and Anne Juliana Gonzaga, while her mother, Mariana, was the daughter of Duke William V of Bavaria and Renata of Lorraine. The marriage between her parents had been arranged to strengthen the Catholic alliance against Protestant powers, but it also further concentrated the genetic material that had been recycling through Central European royal families for generations. Unlike her Spanish Habsburg cousins, who were becoming increasingly isolated within their own genetic and cultural bubble, Maria Anna grew up in a court that remained actively engaged with the broader intellectual and political currents of her time. The Austrian Habsburgs had maintained closer connections to the Renaissance traditions of learning and artistic patronage, while also adapting more flexibly to the religious and political challenges of the Reformation era. Maria Anna's education reflected this broader intellectual engagement. She was fluent in Latin, German, Italian, and Spanish, had studied theology and philosophy, and possessed the kind of broad cultural knowledge that enabled her to serve as an effective patron of arts and learning. But her education also included practical training in statecraft and diplomacy, recognizing that Habsburg women of her generation would need to play active roles in governing territories that were under constant military and political pressure. The physical signs of Habsburg inbreeding were less pronounced in Maria Anna's generation of Austrian Habsburgs than in their Spanish cousins, though they were certainly present. Contemporary portraits show her with the elongated facial structure that was becoming characteristic of the dynasty, but not yet as extreme as it would become in later generations. Court physicians noted that she was frequently ill during her youth, suffering from what they described as delicate constitution and various ailments that modern doctors might recognize as symptoms of autoimmune or hormonal disorders. The marriage between Maria Anna and Ferdinand III in 1631 represented both political necessity and genetic gamble during one of the most dangerous periods in Habsburg history. Ferdinand had inherited the Holy Roman Empire at the height of the 30 Years' War, facing military pressure from Sweden, France, and various German Protestant princes who sought to reduce Habsburg power. The marriage to his first cousin was intended to consolidate Catholic support, while ensuring that any heirs would carry concentrated Habsburg bloodlines. But the genetic risks of the marriage were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Ferdinand himself displayed many of the physical characteristics that were becoming standard features of Habsburg men: the characteristic jaw deformity, a tendency toward melancholy, and various health problems that court physicians attributed to humoral imbalances, but which were likely related to genetic factors. The combination of his genetic burden with Maria Anna's similar inheritance created the potential for children with even more severe problems. The early years of Maria Anna's marriage were dominated by the military and political crises of the 30 Years' War, which required constant attention to diplomatic and strategic concerns. Unlike previous generations of Habsburg women who had focused primarily on bearing heirs and managing court ceremonial, Maria Anna found herself actively involved in the political and military decisions that would determine the survival of the Habsburg Empire in Central Europe. Contemporary accounts describe her as an intelligent and capable advisor to Ferdinand III, with particular skill in diplomatic negotiations and administrative management. She played crucial roles in the complex alliance negotiations that eventually led to the Peace of Westphalia, demonstrating the kind of political sophistication that seemed to run in Habsburg bloodlines alongside their various genetic problems. But even as Maria Anna was proving her political capabilities, she was also facing the biological challenges that plagued all Habsburg marriages of her era. Between 1632 and 1651, she gave birth to 6 children, but only 4 survived to adulthood, and several of those who did survive showed signs of the genetic problems that were becoming increasingly common in Habsburg families. The children who survived Maria Anna's pregnancies carried forward the Habsburg genetic inheritance with its accumulating burden of harmful mutations. The future Leopold I, who would eventually become Holy Roman Emperor, displayed the extreme version of the Habsburg jaw that would make eating and speaking difficult throughout his life. The Archduchess Maria Anna showed signs of what contemporary physicians described as nervous disorders, that might have encompassed various neurological conditions. The reproductive difficulties that Maria Anna experienced were becoming a pattern throughout the Habsburg territories, suggesting that the genetic problems were not limited to isolated cases, but were instead systematic consequences of the dynasty's marriage practices. Court physicians across the empire were reporting similar patterns of miscarriage, infant mortality, and childhood disabilities, though they lacked the scientific framework to understand the underlying causes. Maria Anna's response to these mounting challenges revealed both her personal resilience and the sophisticated political intelligence that characterized the Austrian Habsburgs of her generation. Rather than retreating into religious contemplation as many of her contemporaries did, she threw herself into the practical work of governance, using her administrative skills to help Ferdinand III manage the complex challenges of ruling a war-torn empire. The cultural patronage that marked Maria Anna's career as empress reflected both her personal interests and her political needs. She supported scholars and artists who could enhance the intellectual prestige of the Habsburg court, while also promoting the ideological foundations of Habsburg rule. The Baroque artistic style that flourished under her influence emphasized themes of divine providence and imperial destiny, as if cultural magnificence might compensate for the biological problems that were weakening the dynasty. But perhaps Maria Anna's most significant cultural legacy lay in her support for educational institutions that combined religious instruction with practical training in administration and diplomacy. She founded academies that trained officials who could serve the complex needs of governing a multilingual, multi-confessional empire, recognizing that Habsburg survival depended on effective governance rather than mere genetic legitimacy. The later years of Maria Anna's life were marked by increasing recognition that the Habsburg genetic experiment was approaching its limits. Her children were displaying more pronounced physical abnormalities and health problems than previous generations, while her grandchildren would face even higher risks of genetic disorders. The mathematical progression of inbreeding was creating genetic time bombs that would eventually explode in the form of sterility and dynastic extinction. Maria Anna's approach to these mounting pressures revealed both her Habsburg determination and her realistic assessment of the dynasty's biological prospects. She worked to expand marriage alliances beyond the immediate Habsburg family circle, recognizing that genetic diversity might be necessary for dynastic survival. But the political pressures that had created the Habsburg genetic concentration in the first place made it difficult to implement such changes without undermining the ideological foundations of royal authority. When Ferdinand III died in 1657, Maria Anna faced the prospect of serving as regent for her young son Leopold I, but she chose instead to focus on the cultural and educational projects that she saw as her most lasting contribution to Habsburg legacy. She spent her remaining years supporting institutions that would outlive the dynasty's biological problems, perhaps recognizing that genetic concentration made cultural achievement even more important as a source of historical significance. Maria Anna died in 1646, having witnessed both the military triumphs and the biological failures that would define the later Habsburg experience. Her marriage had produced the heirs necessary to continue the dynasty for another generation, but the genetic burden she passed to her children would become increasingly apparent as they matured and faced their own reproductive challenges. Modern genetic analysis has revealed that Maria Anna's marriage to Ferdinand III, while less extreme than some of the Spanish Habsburg unions, still represented a significant concentration of genetic material that increased the risks of various disorders in their offspring. The inbreeding coefficient of their marriage was sufficient to create substantial risks of recessive genetic diseases, while also reducing the genetic diversity that might have helped the dynasty adapt to changing circumstances. Maria Anna's story thus illustrates both the possibilities and the limitations of Habsburg marriage policy. Her union with Ferdinand III had provided the political stability necessary to survive the 30 Years' War, but it had also contributed to the genetic degradation that would eventually make Habsburg dynastic survival impossible. Her life embodied the tragic contradiction at the heart of royal inbreeding, the pursuit of genetic purity that led inexorably to genetic destruction. Maria Anna of Neuburg, last Habsburg Queen of Spain, in the desperate twilight of Habsburg Spain, as the empire's golden age faded into the grey reality of decline and the royal bloodline approached its biological limits, a young German princess arrived in Madrid, carrying the hopes of a dynasty and a nation. Maria Anna of Neuburg was 28 years old in 1689, when she became the second wife of Charles II, the last Habsburg King of Spain, whose genetic disabilities had already made his first marriage childless, and whose very survival to adulthood had been considered miraculous by the court physicians who attended his troubled youth. The marriage represented both a departure from Habsburg tradition and a final desperate attempt to save a bloodline that generations of systematic inbreeding had brought to the brink of extinction. Unlike previous Spanish royal brides, who had typically been close relatives carrying the same concentrated Habsburg genes, Maria Anna brought what contemporary observers hopefully described as fresh German blood from the Wittelsbach dynasty. Her father, Philip William of Neuburg, was Elector Palatine, and her family had a reputation for fertility and robust health that seemed to offer the Spanish throne its last chance for biological salvation. But even Maria Anna's supposedly advantageous ancestry was more tangled with Habsburg connections than initially apparent. The Wittelsbach family had intermarried with various branches of the Habsburg dynasty over the centuries, creating genetic links that meant her bloodline was not as fresh as Spanish hopes required. Modern genealogical analysis reveals that she shared common ancestors with Charles II through multiple pathways, making their marriage yet another example of royal inbreeding, though less extreme than the uncle-niece unions that had characterized previous Spanish generations. The political context surrounding Maria Anna's marriage was one of mounting international tension and domestic crisis. Charles II's childlessness had created a succession crisis that threatened to tear Europe apart, as various powers positioned themselves to claim pieces of the Spanish Empire when the last Habsburg king inevitably died. The French, Austrians, and other European dynasties were already calculating how they might benefit from Spanish weakness, while within Spain itself, economic decline and administrative incompetence had created conditions that bordered on state collapse. Maria Anna's arrival in Madrid revealed the extent to which the Spanish court had become isolated from the broader currents of European culture and politics. Where other royal courts of the late 17th century were embracing new ideas about science, philosophy, and governance, the Spanish Habsburgs remained trapped in the rigid ceremonial protocols and religious orthodoxy that had defined their court culture for over a century. The new queen found herself in a world that seemed frozen in time, beautiful but strangely lifeless, like an elaborate museum dedicated to a civilization that was slowly dying. The physical reality of Charles II was even more shocking than the reports that had reached Germany before Maria Anna's departure. The king displayed the Habsburg genetic inheritance in its most extreme form yet seen. A jaw so pronounced that he could barely chew food, a tongue so large that speech was difficult, and various other deformities that made normal social interaction challenging. Contemporary accounts describe him as childlike, in many ways, with mental abilities that had never developed beyond an adolescent level despite his age of nearly 30. Yet, despite these severe limitations, Charles II was reportedly capable of genuine affection, and contemporary sources suggest that he and Maria Anna developed a relationship that, while it could not be called romantic in any conventional sense, involved mutual care and respect. The Queen took on many of the practical responsibilities of governance that her husband could not manage, while he provided the ceremonial presence that Spanish royal tradition required. The early years of Maria Anna's marriage were marked by the same desperate hope that had characterized royal marriages throughout Habsburg history: the belief that prayer, medical intervention, and divine providence might overcome the biological obstacles to royal reproduction. Court physicians, working with the limited knowledge available to them, prescribed various treatments designed to enhance fertility and improve the chances of successful pregnancy. These medical interventions ranged from the conventional to the bizarre, reflecting both the desperation of the situation and the supernatural explanations that many attributed to royal infertility. Special diets were prescribed based on humoral theory, bloodletting was performed according to astrological calculations, and various herbal remedies were administered in hopes of balancing the supposed bodily imbalances that prevented conception. More dramatically, the Spanish court turned to religious remedies with an intensity that bordered on mania. Relics of various saints were brought to Madrid for the royal couple to pray over. Special masses were commissioned to invoke divine intervention, and elaborate pilgrimage processions were organized to demonstrate the nation's devotion and worthiness of miraculous blessing. The entire Spanish Empire seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for news that the Queen had conceived. But the months turned to years, and no pregnancy was announced. Maria Anna's failure to conceive became a source of increasing political tension, as various court factions began to blame her for the dynasty's biological collapse. Some whispered that her German origins made her unsuitable for bearing Spanish heirs, while others suggested that her family's Protestant connections had brought divine displeasure upon the marriage. The psychological toll on Maria Anna was immense. Contemporary accounts describe her as becoming increasingly withdrawn and religious, spending long hours in prayer as she sought to understand why God seemed to be denying the Spanish monarchy its last chance for survival. Her letters from this period reveal a woman overwhelmed by the weight of dynastic expectations and her apparent inability to fulfill them. As the years passed without pregnancy, Maria Anna's position at court became increasingly precarious. The same political factions that had welcomed her arrival as a source of biological renewal began to view her as a symbol of dynastic failure. Some courtiers suggested that Charles II should divorce her and attempt a third marriage, though the king's obvious affection for his wife made this politically difficult. The international situation continued to deteriorate as foreign powers positioned themselves for the coming struggle over the Spanish succession. Louis XIV of France was pressing his grandson's claims through his marriage to a Spanish princess, while the Austrian Habsburgs insisted that their branch of the family had the strongest genetic and legal right to inherit Spanish territories. The entire balance of European power hung in the balance, waiting for resolution of a biological crisis that seemed increasingly unlikely to be resolved through natural means. Maria Anna's response to these mounting pressures revealed both her personal resilience and her growing understanding of the political realities surrounding her position. She allied herself with the Austrian faction at court, recognizing that her own survival depended on maintaining Habsburg control of the Spanish succession. But she also worked to moderate the more extreme positions within this faction, understanding that excessive rigidity might provoke French intervention. The cultural patronage that marked Maria Anna's later years as queen reflected both her personal interests and her political needs. She supported artists and writers who could enhance the prestige of the Spanish court while also promoting the legitimacy of Habsburg rule. The Baroque artistic style that flourished under her influence emphasized themes of divine providence and royal destiny, as if cultural magnificence might compensate for biological failure. But perhaps Maria Anna's most tragic role was as a witness to the final collapse of the Spanish Habsburg experiment in genetic concentration. Her marriage, which had represented the dynasty's last hope for biological renewal, had failed to produce the heirs that might have prevented the coming European war. The genetic burden accumulated through centuries of systematic inbreeding had finally reached levels that made reproduction impossible, even with the introduction of supposedly fresh bloodlines. As Charles II's health deteriorated in the final years of his reign, Maria Anna found herself increasingly involved in the succession negotiations that would determine the future of Europe. She worked to support Austrian claims, while also seeking to protect her own position in the event of a change of dynasty. These negotiations revealed her sophisticated understanding of international politics and her determination to salvage what she could from the wreckage of Habsburg Spain. The irony of Maria Anna's position was complete. She had been brought to Spain as the genetic salvation of the Habsburg dynasty, but her failure to produce heirs had instead confirmed the biological impossibility of that salvation. The very bloodline she was supposed to renew had become too genetically compromised to accept even relatively healthy genetic material. Her childlessness was not a personal failure, but the inevitable result of centuries of systematic inbreeding that had finally reached their mathematical limits. When Charles II died in 1700, his will named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, as his heir, precipitating the War of Spanish Succession that would reshape the European balance of power. Maria Anna, now a widow at 39, found herself caught between competing claims and uncertain loyalties. The Austrian faction that had supported her during her marriage now expected her to oppose the French succession, while the new Bourbon rulers of Spain offered her a place at court if she would accept their legitimacy. Maria Anna's final years were spent in the kind of political exile that had become common for Habsburg widows whose bloodlines had failed to produce heirs. She eventually retired to a convent, where she spent her remaining decades in religious contemplation and charitable works. Her death in 1740 marked the end of one of history's most poignant attempts to rescue a royal bloodline from the consequences of its own genetic policies. Modern genetic analysis has revealed that Maria Anna's marriage to Charles II, while representing a departure from the most extreme Habsburg inbreeding practices, still involved sufficient genetic overlap to create substantial risks for any potential offspring. More importantly, Charles II himself was so genetically compromised that successful reproduction would have required genetic compatibility of an almost miraculous nature. The mathematical probability of healthy children from such a marriage was extraordinarily low, regardless of Maria Anna's own genetic heritage. Maria Anna's story thus serves as the final chapter in the Spanish Habsburg experiment with genetic concentration. Her failure to produce heirs marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the conclusion of one of history's most systematic attempts to preserve royal bloodlines through controlled breeding. The genetic time bomb that had been ticking for centuries had finally exploded, bringing down an empire that had once controlled much of the known world. Maria Antonia of Austria lost link to two crowns. In the glittering but genetically compromised world of late 17th century Habsburg courts, where the mathematics of inbreeding were approaching their deadly conclusion, a princess was born who would embody both the last flowering and the final failure of the dynasty's systematic attempt to concentrate divine authority within a single bloodline. Maria Antonia of Austria, born in 1669 to Leopold I, and Margarita Theresa, carried within her delicate frame the accumulated genetic burden of generations of Habsburg intermarriage, while also representing her family's desperate hope for biological and political renewal. Maria Antonia's birth was celebrated throughout the Habsburg territories as a potential solution to the mounting succession crises that threatened both the Austrian and Spanish branches of the dynasty. As the only surviving child of Leopold I's marriage to his niece Margarita Theresa, she represented the convergence of Austrian and Spanish Habsburg bloodlines in their most concentrated form yet achieved. Her genetic inheritance was so mathematically precise in its inbreeding that genealogists would later calculate her coefficient of consanguinity as approaching levels typically seen only in laboratory breeding programs. The circumstances of Maria Antonia's early life reflected the biological and political fragility that characterized the Habsburg dynasty in its final generations. Her mother, Margarita Theresa, had died when Maria Antonia was only 4 years old, succumbing to the complications of repeated difficult pregnancies and the various health problems that plagued Habsburg women. The little princess was raised largely by court officials and Habsburg relatives, growing up in the shadow of the genetic catastrophe that had claimed her mother and numerous siblings. Leopold I, Maria Antonia's father, exemplified the physical extremes to which Habsburg inbreeding had progressed by the late 17th century. His jaw was so prominently deformed that eating required special accommodation, his speech was often difficult to understand, and he suffered from various neurological conditions that made governing the Holy Roman Empire an increasingly challenging task. Yet despite these severe limitations, he had managed to maintain Habsburg control over Central Europe while also producing an heir who might continue the dynasty's political influence. The education provided for Maria Antonia reflected both Habsburg intellectual traditions and the practical recognition that she might need to play active political roles despite her physical limitations. She was taught Latin, German, Italian, and French, studied theology and philosophy, and received training in the diplomatic protocols that governed European court life. But her education also included careful attention to managing the various health problems that were becoming standard features of Habsburg childhood. Contemporary court physicians noted that Maria Antonia displayed many of the physical characteristics that were becoming typical of Habsburg children: breathing difficulties that may have been related to facial deformities, digestive problems that interfered with normal nutrition, and what were diplomatically described as nervous sensitivities that might have encompassed various neurological issues. Her portrait by court painters show her as an attractive child, but careful examination reveals the elongated facial structure and other subtle signs of genetic abnormality that characterized her generation. The question of Maria Antonia's eventual marriage became a source of intense political calculation throughout the Habsburg territories and beyond. Her unique position as the potential heiress to both Austrian and Spanish Habsburg claims made her one of the most valuable marriage prizes in European politics. At the same time, the extreme genetic concentration she represented made any marriage a biological gamble of extraordinary proportions. The marriage eventually arranged for Maria Antonia reflected both Habsburg genetic obsessions and the practical limitations imposed by the dynasty's political needs. In 1685, at the age of 16, she was married to Maximilian II Emanuel of Bavaria, creating a union that combined Habsburg genetic concentration with Bavarian territorial ambitions and military capabilities. The marriage was celebrated as a masterpiece of diplomatic strategy that would strengthen Catholic resistance to French expansion while preserving Habsburg bloodline purity. But from a genetic standpoint, the marriage was yet another dangerous gamble with accumulated genetic damage. Maximilian Emanuel was Maria Antonia's second cousin through multiple pathways, meaning that their children would face inbreeding coefficients that approached the theoretical limits of what human genetics could sustain. The mathematical probability of serious genetic disorders in their offspring was extraordinarily high, though contemporary understanding of heredity was insufficient to recognize these risks. The early years of Maria Antonia's marriage were marked by the military and political crises that characterized European politics in the late 17th century. Maximilian Emanuel was one of the most capable military commanders of his generation, leading imperial forces against the Ottomans in Hungary and later against the French in the War of Spanish Succession. His wife accompanied him on many of these campaigns, displaying the kind of physical resilience that seemed to contradict her genetic fragility. But even as Maria Antonia was proving her political and personal capabilities, she was also struggling with the reproductive challenges that plagued all Habsburg marriages of her era. Her first pregnancy ended in miscarriage, beginning a pattern of reproductive difficulty that would characterize her entire adult life. Contemporary medical records suggest that she suffered from various gynecological problems that made successful pregnancy and childbirth extremely challenging. The few children who resulted from Maria Antonia's marriage displayed the characteristic signs of Habsburg genetic deterioration in its most extreme form yet seen. Her son Joseph Ferdinand, born in 1692, survived to childhood, but showed clear signs of the physical and mental problems that were becoming standard features of Habsburg descendants. Contemporary accounts describe him as intellectually limited, physically frail, and subject to various health problems that required constant medical attention. Despite these obvious genetic problems, Joseph Ferdinand's birth created a political sensation throughout Europe because of his unique position in the succession to the Spanish throne. As the great-grandson of Philip IV, through his mother's lineage, he represented a potential compromise solution to the crisis created by Charles II's childlessness. His inheritance of both Austrian and Spanish Habsburg claims, combined with his father's military capabilities, made him an attractive alternative to either pure French or pure Austrian succession to Spanish territories. The political intrigue surrounding Joseph Ferdinand's potential inheritance revealed the extent to which European diplomacy had become entangled with Habsburg genetic problems. The major powers were essentially gambling on the survival and reproductive capacity of a genetically compromised child whose physical and mental limitations were obvious to anyone who met him. The biological failures of Habsburg inbreeding had become factors in international relations that could determine the fate of empires. Maria Antonia's later pregnancies continued the pattern of reproductive difficulty that characterized her marriage. Several ended in miscarriage, while others produced children who died in infancy or early childhood. The genetic burden represented by her extreme inbreeding made successful reproduction increasingly unlikely, even as political pressures for Habsburg heirs continued to mount. The psychological toll of these repeated reproductive failures was compounded by the political pressure surrounding Maria Antonia's position as the potential mother of Spanish heirs. European diplomats and Habsburg court officials constantly speculated about her health and fertility, treating her body as a political asset whose performance would determine the fate of nations. The personal tragedy of genetic infertility became a matter of international concern. Maria Antonia's response to these mounting pressures revealed both her personal resilience and her growing understanding of the biological impossibilities she faced. She threw herself into cultural patronage and charitable works, perhaps recognizing that artistic and spiritual achievements might provide more lasting legacy than the biological heirs she was unable to produce. Her court in Munich became a center for Baroque art and music that rivaled the cultural achievements of Vienna or Madrid. But even as Maria Antonia was creating cultural monuments to Habsburg achievement, the genetic time bomb, represented by her ancestry, was approaching its final detonation. When Joseph Ferdinand died in 1699, at the age of only 7, the last hope for a Habsburg solution to the Spanish succession crisis died with him. His death precipitated the negotiations that would eventually lead to the War of Spanish Succession and the end of Habsburg rule in Spain. The irony of Joseph Ferdinand's death was particularly cruel. He had been removed from the direct line of Habsburg genetic concentration through his father's Bavarian ancestry, giving him better chances of survival than his more inbred Spanish or Austrian cousins. Yet even this genetic dilution was insufficient to overcome the accumulated damage of generations of Habsburg intermarriage. His death demonstrated that the genetic burden had become so severe that even partial outbreeding could not guarantee dynastic survival. Maria Antonia herself did not long survive her son's death. She died in 1692 at the age of only 23, possibly from complications related to childbirth or to the various genetic disorders that plagued Habsburg women. Her death marked the end of the direct line that might have united Austrian and Spanish Habsburg claims, eliminating the last possibility of preserving dynasty unity through biological rather than military means. Modern genetic analysis has revealed that Maria Antonia's marriage to Maximilian Emmanuel, while representing some dilution of Habsburg genetic concentration, still involved sufficient consanguinity to create extraordinary risks for any offspring. Her children faced inbreeding coefficients that made survival to reproductive age extremely unlikely, while also inheriting accumulated genetic damage that would have made their own reproduction problematic even if they had lived. Maria Antonia's story thus represents both the culmination and the conclusion of the Habsburg experiment with genetic concentration. Her brief life embodied the political possibilities and biological impossibilities that characterized royal inbreeding in its most extreme form. She had carried within her body the potential to unite two great empires, but the genetic burden that gave her this political significance also made it impossible for her to fulfill the biological requirements of dynastic continuity. The geopolitical consequences of Maria Antonia's genetic failures extended far beyond the Habsburg territories themselves. Her inability to produce surviving heirs contributed directly to the War of Spanish Succession, which would reshape the European balance of power and establish new patterns of international relations that would persist for centuries. The biological collapse of Habsburg fertility had become a determining factor in the rise and fall of empires, demonstrating how genetic policies pursued for political reasons could ultimately undermine the political goals they were intended to serve. Marie-Thérèse d'Autriche, Queen of France. In the blazing magnificence of Versailles, where Louis XIV was transforming the art of kingship into a theatrical performance that would define royal culture for generations, a Spanish princess arrived in 1660, carrying within her blood the concentrated genetic legacy of Habsburg inbreeding and the political hopes of two great dynasties seeking to end decades of warfare through matrimonial alliance. Marie-Thérèse d'Autriche was 21 years old, daughter of Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, making her the product of an uncle-niece marriage that had pushed Habsburg genetics to dangerous extremes. The marriage between Marie-Thérèse and Louis XIV represented far more than a diplomatic arrangement. It was a collision between two radically different approaches to royal breeding and court culture. Where the Spanish Habsburgs had pursued genetic purity through systematic inbreeding, the French Bourbons had maintained greater genetic diversity while developing court ceremonies that emphasized royal magnificence through cultural rather than biological claims to divine authority. Marie-Thérèse would spend her life navigating between these contrasting worlds, carrying Spanish genetic burdens into the heart of French royal society. The young Infanta who left Madrid for her French wedding was already displaying many of the physical characteristics that had become standard features of Spanish Habsburg women. Contemporary portraits reveal the elongated facial structure and slightly protruding lower jaw that marked her ancestry, though these features were not yet as pronounced as they would become in her younger brother Charles II. Court physicians noted that she suffered from various health problems that they attributed to delicate constitution, but which modern medical knowledge would recognize as likely symptoms of genetic disorders. Marie-Thérèse's education had been thoroughly Spanish in its emphasis on religious orthodoxy and ceremonial protocol, preparing her for a life of pious devotion and careful adherence to the rigid etiquette that governed Habsburg court culture. She spoke Latin and Spanish fluently, but had limited knowledge of French, creating immediate communication difficulties when she arrived at the French court. More importantly, her upbringing had not prepared her for the intellectual sophistication and cultural innovation that characterized Versailles under Louis XIV's rule. The contrast between Spanish and French court cultures became immediately apparent when Marie-Thérèse took her place as Queen of France, where Spanish royal women lived in relative seclusion, emerging only for carefully choreographed religious and ceremonial occasions. The French court expected queens to participate actively in the complex social rituals that made Versailles the cultural center of Europe. Marie-Thérèse found herself struggling to adapt to expectations that conflicted with everything she had been taught about proper royal behavior. The physical manifestations of Marie-Thérèse's Habsburg inheritance became more pronounced under the stress of adapting to French court life. Contemporary accounts describe her as suffering from persistent nosebleeds that may have been related to the facial deformities common in Habsburg bloodlines. She also struggled with weight gain and what courtiers diplomatically described as digestive delicacy that required special dietary accommodations and frequently disrupted court functions. These health problems were compounded by the psychological strain of living in a court culture that was fundamentally different from anything she had experienced in Spain. The French court's emphasis on wit, sophistication, and cultural refinement made Marie-Thérèse feel inadequate and out of place, while the constant scrutiny of courtiers who viewed her as a foreign curiosity created additional stress that may have exacerbated her genetic vulnerabilities. Louis XIV's reaction to his wife's physical and cultural limitations revealed both the political necessities that drove royal marriages and the personal disappointments they often created. While he treated Marie-Thérèse with the public respect that diplomatic considerations required, he quickly turned his romantic attention to a series of mistresses who better embodied French ideals of beauty and sophistication. The Queen found herself relegated to a ceremonial role, while other women wielded the emotional and political influence that should have been hers. The early years of Marie-Thérèse's marriage were marked by the reproductive challenges that had become tragically familiar in Habsburg families. Between 1661 and 1672, she gave birth to 6 children, but only one survived to adulthood, Louis, the Grand Dauphin, who would inherit his mother's genetic vulnerabilities along with his claim to the throne. The other children died in infancy or early childhood, displaying the pattern of high infant mortality that characterized marriages involving Habsburg genetics. The survival of the Grand Dauphin was celebrated throughout France as evidence of divine blessing on the Bourbon dynasty, but those who observed the child closely noted troubling signs that suggested he had inherited more than just Habsburg legitimacy from his mother. He displayed developmental delays, learning difficulties, and various physical problems that required constant medical attention. Contemporary physicians attributed these issues to weak constitution, inherited from his mother's Spanish lineage. Marie-Thérèse's response to her reproductive struggles revealed both her deep religiosity and her growing isolation within the French court. She spent increasing amounts of time in prayer and religious devotion, perhaps seeking spiritual consolation for the biological failures that had characterized her marriage. Her apartments at Versailles became a center for Spanish religious traditions that seemed increasingly out of place in the culturally innovative atmosphere that Louis XIV was creating. The Queen's religious practices included elaborate devotional exercises that reflected Spanish Habsburg traditions of intense piety, combined with superstitious beliefs about the supernatural causes of royal health problems. She consulted various religious advisors about the spiritual meanings of her reproductive difficulties, seeking explanations that would make sense of tragedies that contemporary medical knowledge could not address. As the years passed, and it became clear that Marie-Thérèse would produce no more surviving children, her position at court became increasingly marginalized. Louis XIV's attention was focused on his mistresses and their children, while the Queen was expected to maintain a dignified silence about arrangements that violated both Spanish Habsburg traditions and Catholic teachings about marital fidelity. Her compliance with these expectations earned her respect for her virtue, but also contributed to her political irrelevance. The cultural patronage that marked Marie-Thérèse's later years as queen reflected both her personal interests and her gradual adaptation to French court expectations. She supported religious art and architecture that combined French technical innovation with Spanish devotional themes, creating a distinctive synthesis that influenced the development of Baroque style at Versailles. Her chapel became a showcase for artists who could blend the cultural traditions of both France and Spain. But perhaps Marie-Thérèse's most significant cultural contribution lay in what her presence at Versailles revealed about the limitations of Habsburg genetic policies. Her physical problems and reproductive difficulties provided a stark contrast to the health and fertility of Louis XIV's mistresses, demonstrating the biological costs of the systematic inbreeding that had characterized Spanish royal marriages. French courtiers began to whisper about the genetic dangers of marrying too closely within royal families. These whispered concerns about Habsburg genetics gained additional urgency as the implications of Marie-Thérèse's inheritance became apparent in her surviving son. The Grand Dauphin's various health problems and learning difficulties suggested that the genetic burden of Spanish inbreeding might affect the French royal family for generations to come. Court physicians began to express private concerns about the wisdom of future marriages that might further concentrate these problematic genetic factors. Marie-Thérèse's later years were marked by increasing withdrawal from the public aspects of court life and deeper immersion in private religious devotion. She established a routine of daily prayers and meditation that occupied most of her time, perhaps finding in spiritual contemplation the peace and purpose that had been denied her in the biological and political aspects of royal life. Her correspondence from this period reveals a woman who had learned to find meaning in religious rather than worldly achievements. The Queen's health deteriorated significantly during her final years, with contemporary accounts describing her as suffering from various ailments that court physicians could neither diagnose nor treat effectively. Modern medical historians have suggested that she may have suffered from autoimmune disorders, cardiovascular problems, or other conditions related to the genetic abnormalities that characterized Habsburg bloodlines. When Marie-Thérèse died in 1683 at the age of 44, Louis XIV remarked that it was the first time she had caused him any trouble, a cruel observation that reflected both his personal indifference to his wife and his recognition that her death would create diplomatic complications with Spain. But her death also marked the end of a tragic experiment in genetic and cultural transplantation that had demonstrated the biological costs of Habsburg inbreeding policies. The legacy Marie-Thérèse left to the French royal family would become apparent in subsequent generations, as her Habsburg genetic inheritance combined with Bourbon bloodlines to create new patterns of health problems and reproductive difficulties. Her son, the Grand Dauphin, would struggle with various ailments throughout his life, while her genetic contribution would echo through French royal families for decades to come. Modern genetic analysis has revealed that Marie-Thérèse's marriage to Louis XIV, while representing some dilution of Habsburg genetic concentration, still involved the introduction of severely compromised genetic material into the French royal bloodline. Her inbreeding coefficient, inherited from generations of Spanish Habsburg intermarriage, was sufficient to create substantial risks for any offspring, risks that were only partially offset by Louis XIV's more diverse genetic inheritance. Marie-Thérèse's story thus serves as both a personal tragedy and a biological cautionary tale, illustrating how the genetic policies pursued by one royal dynasty could have consequences that extended far beyond their own territorial boundaries. Her brief life had demonstrated that royal marriages involved not just the exchange of political alliances, but also the transmission of genetic legacies that could influence the health and survival of future generations across national and dynastic lines. Maria Carolina of Austria, matriarch of Naples. In the sun-drenched kingdom of Naples, where Vesuvius cast its shadow over one of Europe's most turbulent realms, a Habsburg archduchess arrived in 1768 to marry into the Bourbon dynasty and create what would become one of the most genetically complex and politically influential unions of the 18th century. Maria Carolina of Austria was 16 years old, daughter of Empress Maria Theresa and Francis I, carrying within her bloodline the accumulated genetic legacy of Habsburg inbreeding, while also representing her mother's ambitious plans for Austrian diplomatic dominance throughout Europe. The marriage between Maria Carolina and Ferdinand IV of Naples represented both a departure from traditional Habsburg marriage practices and a continuation of the genetic risks that had plagued royal families for centuries. Ferdinand was her double first cousin through a complex web of relationships that connected Austrian Habsburgs with Spanish Bourbons through multiple pathways, creating an inbreeding coefficient that, while not as extreme as some Habsburg marriages, still carried substantial genetic risks for any children the union might produce. Maria Carolina's education had been supervised by her formidable mother, Empress Maria Theresa, who had revolutionized Austrian court culture while also maintaining careful attention to the genetic implications of royal marriages. The young Archduchess had been trained not just in languages, music, and protocol, but also in the practical arts of governance that would be necessary if she were to fulfill her mother's expectations of serving as Austria's political representative in the strategically crucial Kingdom of Naples. The political context surrounding Maria Carolina's marriage was one of shifting alliances and mounting tensions that would eventually explode into the revolutionary upheavals of the late 18th century. Naples controlled vital Mediterranean trade routes, while also serving as a potential base for military operations throughout southern Italy and the western Mediterranean. Austrian influence over Neapolitan policy could determine the balance of power in conflicts with France, Spain, and the emerging threat of revolutionary ideologies. Maria Carolina's arrival in Naples revealed the extent to which Italian royal courts had remained isolated from the intellectual and cultural developments that were transforming northern European society. The Neapolitan court still operated according to Spanish ceremonial protocols established during the previous century, with rigid etiquette and religious orthodoxy that contrasted sharply with the more flexible and innovative court culture that characterized Austrian territories under Maria Theresa's influence. Ferdinand IV himself embodied many of the characteristics that had become typical of royalty, produced by systematic inbreeding, though in his case, the genetic concentration was less extreme than in some Habsburg lines. Contemporary accounts describe him as physically robust, but intellectually limited, with interests that centered primarily on hunting and other outdoor activities, rather than the complex diplomatic and administrative concerns that governed 18th century statecraft. The early years of Maria Carolina's marriage were marked by extraordinary reproductive success that seemed to contradict the genetic risks represented by her ancestry. Between 1772 and 1801, she gave birth to 18 children, a number that was remarkable even by 18th century royal standards, and that suggested either exceptional genetic luck or the beneficial effects of introducing Austrian genetic material into Bourbon bloodlines that had maintained greater diversity than their Habsburg counterparts. But this apparent reproductive triumph was shadowed by disturbing patterns that reflected the genetic burden Maria Carolina carried from her Habsburg ancestry. While many of her children survived to adulthood, several displayed physical abnormalities, learning difficulties, and other problems that suggested the continued presence of harmful recessive genes, despite the apparent dilution achieved through marriage outside the immediate Habsburg family circle. The children who survived Maria Carolina's numerous pregnancies displayed a wide range of physical and mental characteristics that reflected the complex genetic lottery represented by their parentage. Some, like her daughter Maria Theresa, appeared healthy and intelligent, eventually making successful marriages that further diluted the Habsburg genetic concentration. Others showed clear signs of the developmental problems that had characterized Habsburg children for generations. The most troubling pattern emerged in the high rate of infant and child mortality that characterized Maria Carolina's family, despite the large number of births. Contemporary medical records suggest that while she was extraordinarily fertile, many of her children died before reaching reproductive age, displaying the classic pattern of genetic load that afflicts inbred populations. The apparent reproductive success masked biological failures that would have long-term consequences for dynastic survival. Maria Carolina's approach to child-rearing reflected both her Austrian education and her growing understanding of the genetic risks her children faced. She insisted on careful medical attention for all her offspring, employing physicians who were trained in the latest medical techniques available in 18th century Europe. She also supervised their education personally, recognizing that intellectual development might be particularly important for children who might inherit various learning difficulties. The political intelligence that Maria Carolina displayed throughout her career as Queen of Naples revealed capabilities that seemed to contradict contemporary assumptions about the mental limitations that allegedly resulted from royal inbreeding. She quickly mastered the complex diplomatic relationships that governed Mediterranean politics, developing strategies that served Austrian interests while also promoting Neapolitan independence from excessive Spanish or French influence. Her alliance with British naval power during the Napoleonic Wars demonstrated sophisticated understanding of maritime strategy and international finance, as she recognized that control of Mediterranean shipping lanes would be crucial to the outcome of the broader European conflict. The policies she pursued helped maintain Neapolitan independence during a period when most Italian states were being absorbed into French satellite kingdoms. But Maria Carolina's political successes were achieved despite mounting personal and familial pressures that reflected the genetic burden she carried. Several of her children displayed behavioral problems that contemporary observers attributed to nervous disorders, but which modern psychiatrists might recognize as symptoms of various developmental disabilities. The stress of managing these family difficulties, while also governing a kingdom, created enormous psychological pressure. The cultural patronage that marked Maria Carolina's reign reflected both her Austrian intellectual heritage and her adaptation to Italian artistic traditions. She supported musicians, artists, and writers who could enhance the prestige of the Neapolitan court, while also promoting the cultural synthesis that characterized 18th-century European civilization. Her court became a center for opera and other musical forms that combined Austrian sophistication with Italian innovation. The revolutionary upheavals that swept through Europe during the final decades of Maria Carolina's life created political challenges that tested both her diplomatic skills and her genetic resilience. The French Revolution's challenge to traditional royal authority forced her to navigate between competing ideological pressures while also managing the practical problems of governing a kingdom that was geographically vulnerable to revolutionary influence. Her response to these revolutionary challenges revealed both her Habsburg determination and her realistic assessment of the genetic and political limitations facing traditional monarchies. She recognized that royal survival would depend on adaptation to changing circumstances rather than rigid adherence to traditional practices, including the genetic policies that had characterized Habsburg marriage strategies for centuries. The exile that Maria Carolina experienced during the Napoleonic period provided a final test of the resilience that seemed to characterize Habsburg women despite their genetic vulnerabilities. She spent years moving between various European courts, maintaining political connections and family relationships that might eventually enable restoration of Bourbon rule in Naples. Her ability to survive these challenges suggested that Habsburg genetics, while certainly problematic, could still produce individuals of exceptional capability under the right circumstances. When Maria Carolina died in 1814 at the age of 62, she left behind a complex legacy that embodied both the possibilities and the limitations of 18th-century royal marriage policies. Her extraordinary fertility had produced a large family that carried forward both Austrian Habsburg and Italian Bourbon genetic inheritances, but the patterns of infant mortality and developmental problems within that family suggested that genetic risks remained significant despite apparent reproductive success. Modern genetic analysis has revealed that Maria Carolina's marriage to Ferdinand IV, while representing substantial dilution of Habsburg genetic concentration, still involved sufficient consanguinity to create risks for genetic disorders in their offspring. The double first-cousin relationship between the parents created inbreeding coefficients that were lower than classic Habsburg sibling marriages, but still high enough to produce observable effects in their children. Maria Carolina's story thus illustrates both the evolution and the persistence of genetic risks in European royal families during the transition from traditional dynastic policies to more modern approaches to royal marriage. Her life demonstrated that partial outbreeding could reduce, but not eliminate the genetic burden accumulated through generations of systematic inbreeding, while also showing how individual resilience and intelligence could overcome many of the limitations imposed by genetic inheritance. The geopolitical consequences of Maria Carolina's reproductive success extended far beyond the borders of Naples itself, as her numerous children created new webs of royal relationships throughout Europe, while also transmitting Austrian Habsburg genetic material into bloodlines that had previously remained relatively isolated from the most extreme forms of royal inbreeding. Her legacy reminds us that genetic policies pursued for political reasons could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate goals they were intended to serve.